I am the storyteller, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from, and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The cabin was supposed to be our escape. Instead, it became our prison. I remember the excitement in my kids' eyes as we pulled up to the secluded rental, nestled deep in the pine-scented forest. My wife, Sarah, squeezed my hand and smiled. "This is exactly what we needed, Jack," she said, her voice filled with relief. After months of stress at work and the kids' hectic school schedules, we were all ready for a week of peace and quiet. The cabin was everything the pictures promised: rustic charm with modern amenities. Warm, knotty pine walls welcomed us inside, and a stone fireplace dominated the cozy living room. Large windows offered breathtaking views of the surrounding wilderness. As I lugged our bags inside, our kids, Ethan and Lily, raced around exploring every nook and cranny of our temporary home. Their laughter echoed through the rooms, a sound I hadn't heard enough lately. "Dad, can we go explore outside?" Ethan, our 12-year-old, was already by the back door, practically vibrating with energy. I glanced at Sarah, who nodded. "Sure, but stay close to the cabin and be back in an hour for dinner, or..." The smell of Sarah's famous chili filled the air as I settled into an armchair with a book I'd been meaning to read for months. The quiet was blissful, broken only by the occasional bird call or the rustle of wind through the trees. An hour passed, then two. The sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. A knot of worry formed in my stomach. "Sarah, the kids should have been back by now," I said, setting my book aside. She frowned, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "You're right. Can you go check on them? Dinner's almost ready." I stepped out onto the back porch, the wood creaking beneath my feet. "Ethan, Lily, time to come in." My voice echoed through the trees, but no response came. The forest suddenly seemed much darker, the shadows deeper and more menacing. I jogged down the steps, leaves crunching under my feet. "Kids, this isn't funny. Come on out." A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness, and I whirled around. "Ethan? Lily?" Nothing. The knot in my stomach tightened. I pulled out my phone, cursing when I saw no signal. Of course, we were miles from the nearest cell tower. I ran back to the cabin. "Sarah, the kids aren't answering. I'm going to look for them." Her face paled. "I'll come with you." We grabbed flashlights and jackets, then plunged into the darkening forest. Our beams of light cut through the gloom, illuminating gnarled tree trunks and dense underbrush. "Ethan, Lily." We called their names until our throats were raw, but the forest remained eerily silent. An hour passed, maybe more. We'd wandered far from the cabin, and a chill seeped into my bones that had nothing to do with the cooling night air. "Jack," Sarah's voice quavered. "What if..." "No," I cut her off. "They're fine. They have to be." A rustling in the bushes nearby made us both freeze. Our flashlight beams converged on the spot, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw a pair of eyes reflecting the light. But then, nothing. "Did you see that?" Sarah whispered. I nodded, my mouth dry. "Let's head back to the cabin. Maybe they returned while we were out here." We retraced our steps, but the trees all looked the same in the darkness. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized we were lost. "Jack," Sarah's voice was tight with fear. "Where's the cabin?" Before I could answer, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night. It was Lily's voice. We ran towards the sound, branches whipping at our faces. Another scream, closer this time. Then Ethan's voice. "Dad, Mom, help." We burst into a small clearing, our flashlights illuminating a scene from a nightmare. Ethan and Lily huddled together at the base of a massive oak tree, their eyes wide with terror. And surrounding them, closing in, were shapes, dark, hunched figures that seemed to melt into the shadows. "Get away from them," I yelled, charging forward. The shapes retreated into the darkness, but I could still feel their presence watching us from just beyond the reach of our lights. I scooped Lily into my arms while Sarah grabbed Ethan's hand. "Are you okay? What happened?" Lily buried her face in my shoulder, sobbing. Ethan's voice shook as he spoke. "We got lost. It got dark so fast. And then we saw... them..." "Them?" Sarah asked. Ethan nodded, his face pale. "They've been following us, watching us. We tried to find our way back, but they kept herding us deeper into the woods. A twig snapped nearby, and we all jumped. "We need to get back to the cabin," I said. "Now." We stumbled through the forest, the children between us. Every shadow seemed to move, every rustle of leaves a potential threat. The shapes kept pace with us, always just out of sight, but undeniably there. After what felt like hours, we finally saw the warm glow of the cabin's porch light through the trees. We ran the last 100 yards, not stopping until we were inside with the door locked behind us. Sarah immediately checked the kids for injuries while I made sure every window and door was secure. As I drew the curtains in the living room, I caught a glimpse of something moving at the edge of the trees. A dark figure standing unnaturally still, watching the cabin. I quickly closed the curtain, my hand shaking. "Jack?" Sarah's voice pulled me back. "The kids are okay, no injuries, just scared." I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Good, that's good." We settled the kids on the couch, wrapping them in blankets. Ethan's eyes darted to every window while Lily clung to her mother, whimpering softly. "What were those things?" Sarah whispered to me. I shook my head. "I don't know, but we're safe now. We'll leave first thing in the morning." A loud thump on the roof made us all jump. Then another, and another. It sounded like something, or multiple somethings, were walking around up there. Lily started crying again, and Ethan's face went even paler. "They found us," he whispered. I grabbed the fireplace poker, holding it like a weapon. "Sarah, take the kids to the bedroom, lock the door, and don't come out until I say it's safe." She nodded, ushering the children down the hallway. I heard the click of the lock and took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. The thumps on the roof continued, now accompanied by scratching sounds at the windows. I moved from room to room, checking each one, the poker gripped tightly in my sweating hands. In the kitchen, a window shattered. I ran in just in time to see a dark, spindly arm reaching through the broken glass. Without thinking, I swung the poker, connecting with something solid. There was an inhuman shriek, and the arm withdrew. More windows broke. Shadows moved just outside, their forms indistinct but unmistakably not human. I ran from room to room, swinging the poker at anything that tried to get in, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The assault seemed to last for hours. By the time the sun began to rise, every window in the cabin was broken. The floors were covered in glass and leaves blown in by the wind, but somehow, miraculously, nothing had gotten inside. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, the attack stopped. I cautiously approached a window, peering out into the forest. Nothing moved. The woods looked peaceful, innocent in the morning light. I unlocked the bedroom door. Sarah and the kids were huddled together on the bed, their eyes wide and fearful. "Is it over?" Sarah asked. I nodded, exhausted. "I think so. Come on, we're leaving. Now." We threw our belongings haphazardly into our bags and ran to the car. As I started the engine, I looked back at the cabin one last time. For a moment, I thought I saw a face in one of the broken windows, pale, elongated with two large eyes. But then we were driving away, tires kicking up gravel. We didn't speak much on the long drive home, each lost in our own thoughts. The kids fell asleep in the back seat, the ordeal finally catching up with them. Sarah reached over and squeezed my hand. "What do we tell people?" I sighed, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. The truth? That the woods aren't as empty as we think? That there are things out there we can't explain? I shook my head. "They'd think we were crazy." She nodded, understanding. "So we say nothing." "We say nothing," I agreed. But as we drove back towards civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd brushed up against something ancient and unknowable, something that had always been there, hiding in the shadows of the forest, watching and waiting. And I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that our quiet family vacation had changed us forever. The woods may be behind us, but the memory of those dark shapes, those inhuman eyes, would haunt us for the rest of our lives. The cabin was supposed to be our escape. Instead, it showed us a world we were never meant to see, a world that, try as we might, we could never unsee. The silver tray gleamed in the dim hallway light, but its contents made my blood run cold. I never ordered room service, especially not this. I'd checked into the Blackwood Hotel earlier that evening, exhausted from a long day of meetings. The lobby was grand, all polished marble and crystal chandeliers, but there was something off about it. Maybe it was the slightly faded carpet, or the way the receptionist's smile never quite reached her eyes. "Enjoy your stay, Miss Parker," she'd said, handing me the key card. Was it my imagination, or did her fingers linger a moment too long? My room was on the 13th floor. Of course it was. I'm not usually superstitious. But as the elevator climbed, each floor number lighting up in sequence, I felt a growing sense of unease. The room itself was nice enough, spacious, with a king-sized bed and a view of the city skyline. I set my laptop on the desk, intending to get some work done before bed. That's when I noticed the first strange thing: a single red rose in a vase on the nightstand. I hadn't ordered flowers. I picked up the phone to call the front desk, but the line was dead. Odd. I reached for my cell phone instead, only to find I had no signal. Frustrating, but not entirely unusual in an old building like this. Shrugging it off, I decided to take a quick shower before diving into my work. The bathroom was all gleaming white tile and fluffy towels, but the mirror above the sink was slightly tarnished around the edges. As I turned on the shower, the pipes groaned ominously before sputtering to life. The hot water helped ease some of the tension from my shoulders, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I tried to rationalize it: new place, long day, too much coffee. But the nagging sensation persisted. Wrapped in a plush hotel robe, I settled at the desk and opened my laptop. The Wi-Fi was painfully slow, each page taking ages to load. I was in the middle of answering an email when I heard it, a soft knock at the door. I froze, fingers hovering over the keyboard. It was nearly midnight. Who could be knocking? "Room service," a muffled voice called out. My brow furrowed. I hadn't ordered anything. "I'm sorry, there must be some mistake," I called back. "I didn't order room service." Silence. Then another knock, more insistent this time. Sighing, I got up and approached the door. The peephole showed an empty hallway. Great, I thought, some kid playing pranks. But when I opened the door, I found myself face to face with a silver tray. And that's where I am now, staring at its contents with growing horror. Because on that tray is a collection of items that have no business being here. A worn teddy bear I'd lost when I was 8. A mixtape an ex-boyfriend made for me in college. A pair of earrings my grandmother left me in her will, earrings that should be locked away in my apartment back home. My hands shake as I lift the tray and bring it into the room. There's a note tucked underneath the bear. With trembling fingers, I unfold it. "Welcome back, Emily. We've been waiting for you." The door slams shut behind me, making me jump. I whirl around, but there's no one there. Just the empty hallway visible through the peephole. My heart races as I try to make sense of what's happening. How did these things get here? Who brought them? And what did that note mean? Welcome back. I've never stayed at this hotel before. I grab my phone again, desperately trying to get a signal. Nothing. The room suddenly feels smaller, the air thick and oppressive. I need to get out of here. I throw on some clothes and shove my feet into my shoes, not bothering with the laces. As I reach for the door handle, the lights flicker once, twice, and then go out completely. For a moment, I'm plunged into total darkness. Then slowly, a faint green glow emanates from the items on the tray. The teddy bear's eyes seem to follow me as I back away, my back hitting the wall. A low hum fills the air, growing louder by the second. It's coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The mirror in the bathroom begins to rattle in its frame. I fumble for the door handle, my sweaty palm slipping on the cool metal. It won't turn. I'm locked in. "Help!" I scream, pounding on the door. "Somebody help me." But my cries are drowned out by the intensifying hum. The floor beneath my feet begins to vibrate. Pictures fall from the walls, shattering on the carpet. And then, as suddenly as it began, everything stops. The lights flicker back to life, revealing a room in disarray. But the tray and its impossible contents are gone. I slump to the floor, my back against the door, trying to catch my breath. What just happened? Am I losing my mind? A new sound breaks the silence, the cheerful ping of an arriving email. My laptop, somehow undisturbed on the desk, glows with an unread message. On shaky legs, I approach it. The email is from an address I don't recognize. Blackwood Hotel at Eternal. "Com," the subject line reads. "Your stay with us." With a trembling hand, I click it open. "Dear Miss Parker, We hope you're enjoying your return to the Blackwood Hotel. As a valued guest, we've taken the liberty of providing some mementos of your previous stays with us. Your room has been specially prepared to enhance your experience. We do hope you'll join us for the duration of your visit this time. Checking out early can be problematic. Sweet dreams, the management. Previous stays? I've never been here before, have I? A knock at the door makes me jump. Housekeeping, a cheery voice calls out. I approach cautiously, peering through the peephole. An older woman in a maid's uniform smiles back at me, her cart visible behind her. Against my better judgment, I open the door a crack. I'm sorry, I didn't request housekeeping. The maid's smile never wavers. Oh, but dear, you always do. Every time you stay with us, a chill runs down my spine. I've never stayed here before. I insist, my voice quavering. She laughs, a sound like brittle leaves crunching underfoot. Of course you have, Ms. Parker. You've been our guest many, many times. You just never remember. Before I can respond, she pushes past me into the room. I stumble back, watching in stunned silence as she begins to tidy up the mess from earlier. Now, she tuts, picking up a fallen picture frame. We can't have you making such a fuss every time. It upsets the other guests. Other guests? I manage to croak out. What other guests? I haven't seen anyone else. The maid pauses, turning to face me with that same unchanging smile. Oh, they're here. They're always here. Just like you. She resumes her cleaning, humming softly to herself. I watch, paralyzed, as she moves around the room with practiced efficiency. When she's done, it's as if nothing had ever happened. The room is pristine, every item in its place. There we are, she says, satisfied. All better now. You should get some rest, dear. Tomorrow is always a big day here at the Blackwood. As she wheels her cart towards the door, a thought strikes me. Wait, I call out. What did you mean I never remember? What's going on here? The maid pauses in the doorway, her back to me. When she speaks, her voice has lost its cheery tone, replaced by something ancient and cold. Time works differently here, Miss Parker. For some, it's a moment. For others, an eternity. But for you, well, you're special. You keep coming back over and over, always forgetting, always reliving. It's quite fascinating, really. She turns to face me, and I gasp. Her eyes are completely black, like empty voids. Sleep now, she says softly. When you wake, it will all begin again. And who knows? Maybe this time you'll finally remember. The door closes behind her with a soft click. I rush to open it, but it's locked once more. The room spins around me as a wave of dizziness hits. I stumble to the bed, my limbs suddenly heavy. As my eyes close against my will, the last thing I see is the vase on the nightstand. A fresh red rose has appeared, its petals gleaming in the low light. In the morning, I'll wake up in my own bed, in my own apartment. I'll go about my day, attend my meetings, and eventually check into the Blackwood Hotel, tired from a long day of travel. The receptionist will smile, not quite reaching her eyes, and say, "Enjoy your stay, Miss Parker," and it will all begin again. The island wasn't on any map, but it was all I could think about. What started as a dream vacation quickly became a nightmare we couldn't escape. My wife, Lisa, and I had been planning this trip for months. 2 weeks in paradise, just the two of us, to celebrate our 5th anniversary. The brochure promised crystal clear waters, pristine beaches, and the ultimate in relaxation. What it didn't mention was the secrets lurking just offshore. We arrived at our resort on a sunny Tuesday afternoon. The view from our beachfront bungalow was breathtaking. An endless expanse of turquoise water stretching to the horizon. That first evening, as we sipped cocktails on our private deck, I noticed a small dark shape in the distance. "Hey Lisa," I said, pointing. "Is that an island out there?" She squinted, following my gaze. "Huh, I don't remember seeing that on the map. Maybe it's just a shadow." But it wasn't a shadow. As the sun dipped lower, casting a warm golden glow across the water, I could clearly make out the silhouette of an island, its jagged outline stark against the fading light. "We should ask about it tomorrow," Lisa suggested, settling back into her chair. "Maybe there's a day trip or something." I nodded, but something about the island's presence unsettled me. It seemed to loom larger than its size suggested, a dark blot on our perfect tropical landscape. The next morning, I approached the front desk while Lisa was still getting ready for breakfast. The clerk, a young local woman named Amy, greeted me with a bright smile. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson. How are you enjoying your stay so far?" "It's beautiful," I replied. "Actually, I had a question. That island offshore, is it open to visitors?" Amy's smile faltered for just a moment. "Island? I'm sorry, sir, but there are no islands within viewing distance of the resort." I frowned. "But I can see it from our bungalow. It's right there, maybe a few miles out." She shook her head, her expression now carefully neutral. "I assure you, Mr. Thompson, there is no island. Perhaps you saw a passing ship or a cloud formation." I wanted to argue, but something in her tone made me hold back. Instead, I thanked her and walked away, more confused than ever. Over breakfast, I told Lisa about the strange conversation. She looked concerned. "That's weird," she said, stirring her coffee absently. "Why would she deny it? We can both clearly see it." We spent the morning on the beach, but I couldn't relax. My eyes kept drifting to the island, which seemed even more prominent in the bright daylight. Its shoreline was ringed with dense vegetation, and I could swear I saw movement among the trees. As the day wore on, I noticed other guests pointing and whispering about the island, but whenever anyone approached a staff member about it, they received the same denial we had. That night, unable to sleep, I stood on our deck, staring out at the dark shape on the horizon. A faint light flickered among the trees, there one moment and gone the next. My skin prickled with goosebumps despite the warm night air. Suddenly, a low hum filled the air. I watched in disbelief as a small boat emerged from the shadows of the island, its running lights off. It sped towards the resort, disappearing from view as it neared the shore. Heart pounding, I shook Lisa awake. "Someone just came from the island," I whispered urgently. "We need to find out what's going on." She blinked at me sleepily. "What? Jack, it's the middle of the night. You're probably just seeing things." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I pulled on some clothes and slipped out of the bungalow, ignoring Lisa's protests. The resort was eerily quiet as I made my way towards the beach. As I rounded a corner, I saw a group of people unloading crates from a small boat. They worked quickly and silently, their faces hidden in the shadows. I ducked behind a palm tree, my heart racing. What was in those crates? Drugs? Weapons? My mind spun with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. A twig snapped beneath my foot, and one of the figures turned sharply in my direction. I held my breath, pressing myself against the rough bark of the tree. "Hey!" a voice called out. "Who's there?" I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in our bungalow, gasping for air. Lisa sat up in bed, her eyes wide with concern. "Jack? What happened?" I told her everything I'd seen, the words tumbling out in a frantic rush. She listened in stunned silence, her face growing paler by the second. "We need to leave," she said finally. "First thing in the morning. This isn't safe." I nodded, relieved she believed me. We spent the rest of the night packing our bags, jumping at every sound outside. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, we wheeled our suitcases to the front desk. Amy was there again, her smile as bright and false as ever. "Checking out early?" she asked, her tone light but her eyes sharp. "Family emergency," Lisa lied smoothly. "We need to get home right away." Amy's fingers flew over the keyboard. "I'm so sorry to hear that. Let me just pull up your reservation." She frowned at the screen. "Oh dear, it seems there's a problem with your booking. The system won't let me check you out." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean it won't let you? We're leaving. Now." Amy's smile never wavered. "I understand, sir, but I'm afraid that's not possible. Your stay with us isn't over yet." A cold feeling crept up my spine. I grabbed Lisa's hand and turned to leave, but two large men in resort uniforms blocked our path. "Please," Amy said, her voice suddenly hard. "Return to your bungalow. We'll sort this out later." The next few days were a blur of fear and confusion. We were prisoners in paradise, our every move watched. Other guests seemed oblivious to our plight, laughing and playing on the beach as if nothing was wrong. Each night, I watched the boat make its clandestine journey from the island. Once, I saw a group of people being escorted onto it, looking dazed and compliant. They never returned. We tried to warn other guests, but no one believed us. They all insisted there was no island, no boat, no danger. It was as if the entire resort was under some kind of spell. On our fifth night of captivity, Lisa shook me awake. "Jack," she whispered urgently. "Look." I followed her gaze to the window. A dense fog had rolled in, obscuring everything beyond our bungalow, but in the distance a light pulsed rhythmically. It was coming from the island. "It's a signal," I realized. "They're calling the boat." Lisa's eyes were wide with fear and determination. "This might be our only chance," she said. "We have to try to escape." Heart pounding, we gathered what we could carry and slipped out into the fog. The resort was eerily silent, the usual sounds of nighttime revelry absent. We made our way to the beach, the damp sand muffling our footsteps. The small dock where I'd seen the boat land was deserted. We crouched behind some crates waiting. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Then, finally, we heard it, the low hum of an approaching engine. The boat materialized out of the fog, a dark shape against the gray backdrop. As it bumped against the dock, we tensed, ready to make our move. But before we could, a group of resort staff appeared, led by Amy. They began unloading more crates, working with practiced efficiency. "Now," Lisa whispered, tugging my arm. We darted from our hiding place, sprinting down the dock. Shouts of alarm erupted behind us, but we didn't look back. We leapt onto the boat just as it started to pull away. The captain, a grizzled man with hard eyes, turned to us in shock. "What the—" I didn't let him finish. Adrenaline pumping, I tackled him, wrestling for control of the wheel. Lisa grabbed a nearby rope, quickly binding the man's hands and feet. Breathing heavily, I took the wheel, steering us into the fog. Behind us, angry voices faded into the distance. As we neared the island, its true nature became clear. What we had thought was dense vegetation was actually a jumble of buildings and equipment, carefully camouflaged. Lights blazed from windows, and figures moved about with purpose. "My God," Lisa breathed. "What is this place? We never got the chance to find out." As we approached the shoreline, searchlights suddenly blazed to life, blinding us. Alarms blared, and I could hear the sound of more boats approaching. "We have to go back," I said, my voice shaking. "We can't dock here." Lisa nodded, her face pale but determined. I spun the wheel, turning us back towards the open sea. We sped past the other boats, their occupants shouting and gesturing wildly. For hours, we pushed the little boat to its limits, always staying just ahead of our pursuers. As dawn broke, we finally spotted another island in the distance, a real one this time, with a bustling port and normal-looking buildings. We docked among a cluster of fishing boats, our legs shaky as we set foot on solid ground. The local police were skeptical of our story at first, but the boat's captain, once untied, corroborated enough of it to launch an investigation. Weeks later, we learned the truth. The resort was a front for a massive human trafficking operation. The island served as a processing center, where people were sorted and shipped off to buyers around the world. Hundreds of victims were rescued, and a network of corrupt officials and business owners was exposed. Lisa and I returned home, shaken but grateful to be alive. We never did take another tropical vacation. Some paradises, we learned, are better left unexplored. I never thought a smile could be so terrifying until I met Mrs. Anderson. Her friendly wave became the herald of my nightmares, and her constant presence turned our dream home into a prison of paranoia. It all started the day we moved in. The moving truck had just pulled away, leaving boxes strewn across our new front lawn. I was struggling with a particularly heavy one when I heard a cheerful voice behind me. "Welcome to the neighborhood." I turned to see a woman in her 60s, impeccably dressed with a plate of cookies in her hands. Her smile was wide, almost too wide, stretching across her face in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm Margaret Anderson," she said, extending the plate. "I live next door. Thought you might need a little pick-me-up after all that heavy lifting." "Thanks," I said, taking a cookie. "I'm Sarah. My husband Tom and our kids are inside somewhere, probably arguing about where to put the couch." Mrs. Anderson's eyes lit up. "Oh, you have children? How wonderful. I do so love the sound of little ones playing." Something in her tone made me pause mid-bite. There was an intensity to her words that seemed out of place, but I brushed it off as neighborly enthusiasm and invited her in for a tour. As we walked through the house, Mrs. Anderson commented on everything: the paint colors, the layout, even the view from each window. It was like she was cataloging every detail. When we reached the kids' rooms, she lingered, running her hand over the door frames with an almost reverent touch. "Such lovely spaces for growing minds," she murmured. "You must be so proud." I nodded, suddenly eager to end the tour. "Well, we should probably get back to unpacking. Thanks again for the cookies." Mrs. Anderson's smile never wavered. "Of course, dear. Don't hesitate to ask if you need anything. I'm always watching. I'm always around to help." As I watched her walk back to her house, a chill ran down my spine despite the warm summer air. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of unpacking, settling in, and starting new routines. Mrs. Anderson was a constant presence, always popping by with some baked goods or a helpful suggestion about lawn care or local schools. At first, I appreciated her friendliness, but soon her visits began to feel less like neighborly gestures and more like inspections. One afternoon, I was in the backyard with my daughter Emma, helping her practice cartwheels. I heard the distinct sound of a camera shutter and looked up to see Mrs. Anderson lowering her phone. "Oh, don't mind me," she called out, waving from her upstairs window. "I just love capturing special moments. You two look so adorable together." I forced a smile and waved back, but inside my stomach churned. Why was she photographing us? And how long had she been watching? That night I mentioned it to Tom. He laughed it off, saying she was probably just a lonely old woman who missed having kids around. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had taken root in my gut. As days turned into weeks, Mrs. Anderson's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She seemed to know our schedules better than we did, often appearing just as we were leaving for work or school. Once I came home to find her in our backyard, pruning our rose bushes without invitation. "I hope you don't mind," she said, her ever-present smile firmly in place. I noticed they needed a little TLC, and I just couldn't help myself. I wanted to be angry, to tell her to stay off our property. But something in her eyes stopped me. There was a hunger there, a desperate need that made me hesitate. "That's very kind of you," I managed to say. "But please, in the future, ask before coming onto our property." Her smile flickered for just a moment, a flash of something dark crossing her face. Then it was gone, replaced by her usual cheerful expression. "Of course, dear, I wouldn't want to overstep." But she did overstep again and again. She showed up at Emma's soccer game, cheering louder than any of the parents. She appeared at the grocery store, coincidentally shopping at the same time as me. She even started leaving voicemails with detailed weather reports, just in case we forgot to check the forecast. The breaking point came on a crisp October evening. Tom and I were enjoying a rare night out, leaving the kids with a babysitter. We returned home to find Mrs. Anderson sitting on our porch, a look of disapproval on her face. "I saw that young girl you left in charge," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "She had her boyfriend over. They were very inappropriate." My blood ran cold. How did she know? Had she been watching our house the entire time we were gone? Tom, usually the calm one, finally snapped. "Mrs. Anderson, this has to stop. You can't keep spying on us. We appreciate your concern, but it's becoming intrusive." For a moment, Mrs. Anderson's facade cracked. Her smile vanished, replaced by a look of such raw pain and loneliness that I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "I'm just trying to help," she whispered. "To keep you safe. To be part of—" She trailed off, her eyes filling with tears. Tom softened slightly. "We understand you might be lonely, but this isn't the way to make friends. You need to respect our privacy." Mrs. Anderson stood up slowly, her shoulders hunched. "You don't understand," she said, her voice suddenly cold. "None of you ever understand." She walked away, disappearing into the darkness of her own home. Tom and I exchanged worried glances before hurrying inside to check on the kids. The next morning, Mrs. Anderson's house was quiet. No lights, no movement. Days passed, and we saw no sign of her. Part of me was relieved, but another part worried. Had we been too harsh? A week later, a police car pulled up in front of her house. Curious, I wandered over to where a small group of neighbors had gathered. "What's going on?" I asked. A woman I recognized from down the street leaned in, her voice low. "They found Mrs. Anderson. She took her own life." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Mrs. Anderson dead? Despite everything, I felt a pang of guilt. Had our confrontation pushed her over the edge? As the police conducted their investigation, more details emerged. Mrs. Anderson had lost her husband and young daughter in a car accident decades ago. She'd never fully recovered, becoming increasingly isolated and fixated on the families around her. In her house, they found dozens of photo albums filled with pictures of neighborhood children, including ours. There were journals detailing our daily routines, our conversations, even what we ate for dinner. It was a shrine to the family life she'd lost and desperately wanted to reclaim. The most chilling discovery was in her basement, a room meticulously decorated to match Emma's bedroom in our house, right down to the stuffed animals on the bed. On the wall, a calendar with a date circled in red, the day after we'd confronted her on our porch. The police believed she had been planning to take Emma, to recreate the family she'd lost. Our argument had derailed her plans, leading to her tragic decision. In the days that followed, our quiet suburb was a whirlwind of police interviews, concerned neighbors, and news vans. We installed a security system, added extra locks to the doors and windows, but no alarm could protect us from the guilt and fear that now permeated our once happy home. Months have passed, and life has slowly returned to normal, or at least a new version of normal. Mrs. Anderson's house stands empty, a silent reminder of the tragedy that unfolded. Sometimes I catch myself glancing at her windows, half expecting to see her watching us. The kids no longer play in the front yard, and I double-check the locks every night. We've talked about moving, starting fresh somewhere new, but part of me wonders, would it really make a difference? The world suddenly seems full of Mrs. Andersons, their smiles hiding desperate loneliness and dangerous obsessions. Every friendly wave from a neighbor now carries a hint of suspicion. Every act of kindness is scrutinized for ulterior motives. Our dream home has become a fortress, and trust feels like a luxury we can no longer afford. As I sit on our porch watching the sun set over our quiet street, I can't help but think about Mrs. Anderson, about the pain she must have carried for so long, and the desperation that drove her to such extremes. I think about how a simple act of neighborly kindness twisted into something dark and frightening. And I wonder, as I watch a new family move into Mrs. Anderson's old house, their children laughing as they explore their new home, how well do we ever really know our neighbors? What secrets lie behind those friendly smiles and waves? And how do we balance openness and caution in a world where the greatest dangers might be hiding in plain sight, just on the other side of a white picket fence? The sun dips below the horizon, casting long shadows across our lawn. I stand up, take one last look at Mrs. Anderson's old house, and go inside. As I lock the door behind me, I say a silent prayer for Mrs. Anderson, for my family, and for all the lonely souls out there searching for connection in all the wrong ways. Because in the end, the scariest monsters aren't the ones that hide under our beds or in our closets. They're the ones that live next door, smile and wave, and offer us cookies, all while plotting to destroy the very thing they so desperately crave. The chairlift jerked to a halt, leaving us dangling over the abyss. As the icy wind whipped around us, I realized our dream ski vacation had just become a nightmare. It was supposed to be the perfect family getaway. My wife Karen and our two kids, Ethan 14 and Lily 10, had been looking forward to this trip to Aspen for months. I'd splurged on a fancy ski resort, determined to make up for all the weekends I'd missed due to work. The first couple of days were great. The slopes were pristine, the hot chocolate was rich, and the laughter of my family echoed through our cozy chalet. But on the third day, things started to go wrong. It began with little things. Ethan's ski bindings mysteriously came loose during a run, sending him tumbling. Lily's brand new goggles disappeared from our locker. Karen's favorite gloves went missing. "Must be gremlins," I joked, trying to lighten the mood. But Karen's frown told me she wasn't amused. That night, as we sat around the fireplace in the resort's grand lobby, I overheard a heated conversation between two staff members. "It's happening again," one whispered urgently, "just like last season." "Shh," the other hissed, glancing nervously around the room. Their eyes met mine and they quickly dispersed. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature ran down my spine. What was happening again? And why did they look so scared? The next morning, we decided to try a new trail. As we approached the chairlift, I noticed the operator looked tense, his eyes darting back and forth. "Everything okay?" I asked as we prepared to board. He plastered on a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, sir. Enjoy your ride." We were about halfway up the mountain when the lift shuddered to a stop. At first we thought it was just a momentary pause. These things happen, right? But as minutes ticked by, a sense of unease settled over us. "Dad, I'm cold," Lily whimpered, huddling closer to Karen. "It's okay, sweetie," I reassured her, even as doubt gnawed at my gut. "They'll get us moving soon." But they didn't. The wind picked up, howling around us like a hungry beast. Snow began to fall, thick flakes obscuring our view of the resort below. After what felt like hours, we heard a crackle from the speakers attached to the lift tower. "Attention passengers," a voice announced, tension evident even through the static. "We are experiencing technical difficulties. Please remain calm. Our team is working to resolve the issue." "Technical difficulties?" Ethan scoffed. "More like someone's messing with us." I wanted to dismiss his comment, but after the strange occurrences of the past few days, I wasn't so sure. As darkness fell, the temperature plummeted. We huddled together, sharing what little warmth we could. Lily had long since stopped complaining, her silence more worrying than her earlier whimpers. Suddenly, a scream pierced the night, coming from further up the mountain. Karen grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in painfully. "What was that?" she whispered, her breath visible in the frigid air. Before I could respond, we heard it again, a horrifying shriek that seemed to echo off the surrounding peaks. It was followed by a series of loud cracks and a rumbling that shook our lift chair. "Avalanche?" I breathed, my heart racing. But it didn't sound quite right. The rumbling was too rhythmic, almost like footsteps. A massive shape loomed out of the darkness, moving with impossible speed for its size. It was vaguely humanoid but grotesquely misshapen, with limbs that seemed too long and a head that was little more than a gaping maw. As it passed beneath us, I caught a glimpse of its eyes, cold, dead things that nonetheless burned with malevolent intelligence. It was carrying something, a limp form that I realized with horror was a person. "Oh my God," Karen gasped, clapping a hand over her mouth. The creature paused, its head swiveling in our direction. For a heart-stopping moment, I was sure it had heard us, but then it continued on, disappearing into the swirling snow. "Dad," Ethan's voice quavered, all teenage bravado gone. "What the hell was that?" I shook my head, unable to form words. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what we'd just seen. It was impossible, and yet the lift jerked back to life so suddenly that we nearly fell out. As we descended, I saw figures moving rapidly on the slopes below, their headlamps cutting through the darkness. When we reached the bottom, a group of grim-faced resort staff was waiting. They hurried us inside, their eyes darting nervously to the mountain looming behind us. The lobby was chaos. Guests were demanding answers, children were crying, and the staff looked overwhelmed. I managed to pull aside one of the employees I recognized from earlier. "What's going on?" I demanded. "What was that thing up there?" He paled, glancing around before leaning in close. "You saw it?" he whispered. When I nodded, he cursed under his breath. "They said it was just a story, a legend to scare the tourists. But it's real. The Wendigo is real." "Wendigo?" Karen interjected, overhearing. "Like the Native American myth?" The employee nodded solemnly. "This resort, it was built on sacred land. The elders warned us, but the owners didn't listen. And now it's awake and it's hungry." A commotion near the front desk drew our attention. A distraught couple was pleading with the manager. "Please, you have to help us find her," the woman sobbed. "Our daughter, she's missing." My blood ran cold as I remembered the limp form in the creature's arms. The manager tried to calm them down, spouting reassurances about search parties and bad cell reception. But I saw the fear in his eyes. He knew. As the night wore on, more reports of missing guests trickled in. The staff grew increasingly frantic, huddling in corners and whispering urgently. I overheard snippets about containing the situation and calling in the experts. I gathered my family close, grateful beyond words that we were all safe. But the terror of what we'd witnessed hung over us like a shroud. Around midnight, a group of stern-looking men in dark suits arrived. They conferred briefly with the manager before addressing the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," one of them announced, his voice carrying an air of authority. "Due to unforeseen circumstances, we are evacuating the resort. Buses will arrive shortly to transport you to a safe location. Please gather your belongings and prepare to depart." A ripple of confusion and fear swept through the room. Evacuating, in the middle of the night, during a snowstorm? As we packed our things, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were fleeing from something far worse than bad weather. The image of that monstrous shape on the mountain haunted me, its hunger palpable even from a distance. The bus ride down the mountain was tense and silent. Lily had finally succumbed to exhaustion, sleeping fitfully in Karen's arms. Ethan stared out the window, his face pale and drawn. Just as we reached the base of the mountain, a bone-chilling howl echoed through the night. The bus driver accelerated, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. We were housed in a nearby town, the authorities citing an environmental hazard at the resort. But I saw the way they looked at us, the survivors. They knew we'd seen something we shouldn't have. In the days that followed, news reports trickled in. The resort was closed indefinitely. Search parties combed the mountain but found no trace of the missing guests. Experts were flown in to assess the situation. But late at night, when the wind howls just right, I swear I can still hear it, that terrible hungry cry echoing across the peaks. And I know that somewhere up there, in the pristine snow and soaring pines, an ancient evil has awakened, an evil that no amount of luxury amenities or corporate cover-ups can contain. We never went skiing again after that. The mountains, once a source of exhilaration and beauty, now loom in my nightmares as dark sentinels hiding unimaginable horrors. And every winter when the first snow falls, I find myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see a misshapen shadow and those cold, dead eyes watching, waiting, hungry. The old house creaked and groaned, but it wasn't the pipes that kept me awake that night. It was the woman in the basement, her eyes wild and her words even wilder. I've been an emergency plumber for 15 years and I thought I'd seen it all. Burst pipes, flooded basements, even the occasional snake in a toilet. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered at 1313 Mockingbird Lane. It was a Tuesday night just past 1 a.m. when I got the call. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio, giving me the address and a brief description of the problem. Leak in the basement, urgent situation. I sighed, grabbed my toolbox, and headed out into the night. The house loomed before me, a Victorian monstrosity that seemed to sag under the weight of its own history. Paint peeled from the siding in long, curling strips, and the porch steps groaned ominously under my feet. I hesitated for a moment before knocking, a chill running down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Just as I was about to call it in as a no-show, the door creaked open of its own accord. "Hello?" I called out, peering into the dimly lit foyer. "Emergency plumber? Anyone home?" Silence greeted me, broken only by the steady drip, drip, drip of water from somewhere deep within the house. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The interior was a mess of faded wallpaper and dusty antiques. A single bulb flickered weakly in the hallway, casting long shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. The dripping sound grew louder as I made my way towards what I assumed was the basement door. As I reached for the handle, a voice drifted up from below, so faint I almost missed it. "Down here," it whispered, sending a shiver through me. "Please help me." I hesitated, my hand hovering inches from the door. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to get out of this house and never look back. But I was here to do a job, and someone clearly needed help. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door and descended into the darkness. The basement was a cavern of shadows, lit only by the weak beam of my flashlight. Water glistened on the concrete floor, reflecting the light in eerie patterns. And there, huddled in the far corner, was a woman. She was older, maybe in her 60s, with wild gray hair and eyes that seemed too large for her face. Her clothes were soaked, clinging to her thin frame like a second skin. As my light fell on her, she blinked rapidly like a creature unused to illumination. "Ma'am," I said, approaching cautiously. "I'm here about the leak. Are you all right?" She didn't answer directly, just kept muttering under her breath, her eyes darting around the room as if following invisible movements. As I got closer, I could make out some of her words. "They're coming. The walls are too thin. Can't keep them out much longer." A chill ran down my spine. This was way above my pay grade. I needed to fix the leak and get out of here fast. I spotted the source of the problem quickly enough, A rusted pipe near the ceiling, water spraying in a fine mist. As I set to work, the woman's muttering grew louder, more frantic. "You don't understand," she said, suddenly clear. "The water isn't the problem. It's what's in the water." I tried to focus on my task, but her words wormed their way into my mind. "What do you mean, ma'am?" She crawled closer, her movements jerky and unnatural. "They use the pipes, you see, to get in, to whisper their secrets. But I've been listening. Oh yes, I've been listening for years." My hands shook as I tightened the last bolt. The leak slowed to a trickle, then stopped altogether. In the sudden silence, the woman's breathing seemed unnaturally loud. "There," I said, forcing a smile. "All fixed. Now, is there someone I can call for you? Family, maybe?" She laughed, a high, brittle sound that set my teeth on edge. "Family? Oh no, dear boy, they're long gone. Taken, you see. But I outsmarted them. I'm the only one left." I backed away slowly, my toolbox clutched to my chest like a shield. "Right. Well, if you're sure you're okay, I'll just be going then." As I turned to leave, her hand shot out, gripping my ankle with surprising strength. "Wait," she cried. "You have to listen, you have to understand." I tried to pull away, but her grip was like iron. "Let go, ma'am, please." Her eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment I saw something in their depths that turned my blood to ice. It wasn't madness I saw there, or at least not just madness. It was knowledge, terrible, burdensome knowledge that no human was meant to possess. "They're in the pipes," she whispered, her voice taking on a sing-song quality. "In the walls, in the very air we breathe. Watching, waiting. And now that you've fixed the leak, you've opened the door for them." A low rumble filled the air, like distant thunder, but the sky had been clear when I arrived. The woman's grip tightened, her nails digging into my skin. "Do you hear them?" she asked, a manic grin spreading across her face. "They're coming, and this time they're coming for you." With a burst of panic-fueled strength, I wrenched my leg free and bolted for the stairs. Behind me, the woman's laughter echoed off the damp walls, rising to a hysterical pitch. I took the steps 2 at a time, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the top, a gust of wind slammed the basement door shut, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for the handle, my fingers slipping on the smooth metal. The rumbling grew louder, and I swore I could hear voices in it now. Countless whispers layered over each other, speaking in languages I couldn't understand, but that filled me with a primal dread. Finally, the door gave way, and I stumbled into the hallway. I didn't stop running until I was out of the house and in my truck, my hand shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I peeled away from the curb, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The woman stood in the doorway, her pale face gleaming in the moonlight, and behind her, in the windows of the upper floors, I saw shapes moving, fluid, impossible shapes that hurt my eyes to look at. I drove through the night, not stopping until I was miles away, and the sun was peeking over the horizon. Only then did I pull over and try to make sense of what had happened. The logical part of my brain tried to rationalize it all away. The woman was clearly disturbed, and the rest was just my imagination running wild in a creepy old house. But deep down, I knew better. I had glimpsed something that night, something ancient and alien and utterly terrifying. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Water made me nervous. Every dripping faucet, every puddle on the street seemed to hide unspeakable horrors. I started taking showers instead of baths, and I never lingered long under the spray. I considered quitting my job, but the thought of someone else encountering what I had, someone unprepared, kept me at it. I became known as the guy you called for the weird jobs, the ones in the old houses that other plumbers avoided. And every time I work on a pipe or fix a leak, I listen carefully, not just for the normal sounds of water and metal, but for something else, for whispers, for the rumble of something stirring in the depths, because now I know the truth that the woman in the basement tried to warn me about. The pipes aren't just for water. They're conduits for things we were never meant to encounter. And somewhere out there in the vast network of pipes and sewers that runs beneath our feet, those things are waiting, watching. And one day they'll find their way in. The forest had eyes, and they were all fixed on me. What started as a peaceful solo hike turned into a desperate fight for survival against an unseen predator. I've always been an outdoors enthusiast. There's something about the solitude of nature that recharges my soul like nothing else. So when I had a few days off work, I decided to tackle a challenging trail in the remote wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. The morning I set out was perfect crisp autumn air, a light mist hanging over the trees, and the promise of adventure ahead. I parked my car at the trailhead, double-checked my backpack, and set off into the woods with a spring in my step. The first few hours were everything I'd hoped for. The trail wound through ancient forests, the towering trees creating a cathedral-like canopy above me. I stopped occasionally to take photos or consult my map, reveling in the peaceful solitude. It wasn't until early afternoon that I first felt it, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, as if someone was watching me. I whirled around, half expecting to see another hiker, but the trail behind me was empty, the forest still and silent. I shook off the feeling and pressed on, but it lingered, growing stronger with each passing mile. The woods seemed to close in around me, the shadows deepening despite the midday sun. More than once I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, only to find nothing when I turned to look. As the day wore on, my unease grew. The trail markers became less frequent, and I found myself checking my map more often. The cheerful birdsong that had accompanied me earlier faded away, replaced by an oppressive silence broken only by the crunch of leaves under my boots. I was considering turning back when I heard it, a low, guttural sound that was neither human nor any animal I recognized. It echoed through the trees, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My heart rate spiked, and I picked up my pace, no longer caring about the scenery. The sound came again, closer this time. I broke into a run, my backpack bouncing painfully against my spine. Branches whipped at my face as I veered off the trail, driven by blind panic. I had no idea where I was going, only that I needed to get away from whatever was behind me. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. Finally, I collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath. As my pulse slowly returned to normal, I realized with growing horror that I had no idea where I was. In my panic, I'd left the trail far behind. Night was falling fast, the forest transforming into a maze of deep shadows and unfamiliar shapes. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking as I flicked it on. The narrow beam did little to penetrate the darkness, instead creating grotesque shadows that seemed to move and shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I needed to find shelter, to regroup and figure out a plan. As I scanned the area, my light fell on what looked like a small cave entrance partially hidden by undergrowth. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than spending the night completely exposed. I made my way towards it, every snapping twig and rustling leaf setting my nerves on edge. Just as I reached the entrance, I heard it again, that inhuman sound, much closer now. I dove into the cave, pressing myself against the cold stone wall. For hours I huddled there, straining my ears for any sign of pursuit. Occasionally I'd hear movement outside, heavy footsteps circling the cave, branches breaking under significant weight. Whatever it was, it knew I was there, and it was patient. As the night wore on, exhaustion began to overtake fear. Despite my best efforts, I felt my eyelids growing heavy. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a deafening roar just outside the cave entrance. I scrambled backwards, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the cave walls. And then I saw it, a massive shadowy figure blocking the entrance. It was vaguely humanoid, but much too large, with unnaturally long limbs and a head that seemed to shift and change shape as I watched. I wanted to scream, but terror had frozen my vocal cords. The creature took a step forward, its movements fluid and predatory. In the dim light, I caught a glimpse of its eyes, cold, black, and filled with an intelligence that was anything but animal. In that moment, I knew with certainty that I was going to die. This thing, whatever it was, had been toying with me all day. The hunt was over and I had lost. But as it reached for me, a strange calm settled over me. If this was how it ended, I wasn't going to cower in the corner. I gripped my flashlight tightly and lunged forward, swinging it with all my might at the creature's head. To my utter shock, it connected. The thing reeled back with a shriek of pain or surprise. I wasn't sure which. Not waiting to see if I'd actually heard it, I ran. I burst out of the cave and into the pre-dawn forest. my feet barely touching the ground as I flew between the trees. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing in a small clearing as the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the canopy. For a long time, I just lay there, gulping in air and waiting for the attack that never came. As full daylight arrived, I slowly got to my feet, every muscle screaming in protest. I was lost, exhausted, and terrified, but I was alive. And in the light of day, my encounter in the cave seemed almost dreamlike. Had I imagined it all? But then I saw the state of my clothes, torn and dirty, with long scratches on my arms that I didn't remember getting, and clutched in my hand, my flashlight was bent and dented, dark stains on its surface that I didn't want to examine too closely. It took me most of the day to find my way back to a marked trail, and several more hours to reach my car. As I drove home, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Was it some unknown species, a hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion? Or something else entirely, something that defied rational explanation? In the weeks that followed, I scoured the internet for similar stories, for any clue as to what I'd encountered in those woods. I found more than I expected. Tales of hikers gone missing, of strange sightings and unexplained sounds in forests across the country. Most were easily dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications, but some rang eerily true. I never reported my experience to the authorities. Who would believe me? But I did hang up my hiking boots, at least for solo trips. These days I stick to well-traveled trails and always hike with a group. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I swear I can hear that low, guttural sound outside my window, and I know deep in my bones that the thing from the forest is still out there, waiting, watching, and someday it might just come looking for me again. So if you're ever hiking alone in the deep woods, and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck like someone's watching you, don't dismiss it. Don't tell yourself it's just your imagination. Because sometimes the monsters in the shadows are all too real, and not everyone who encounters them lives to tell the tale. I never thought a kiss could taste like danger until I met him. What started as a harmless flirtation in our sleepy town quickly spiraled into a nightmare I couldn't escape. When Mark and I moved to Millbrook, we were full of hope. The quaint streets lined with maple trees and the friendly faces of our neighbors promised the fresh start we desperately needed after years of grinding in the city. Mark threw himself into his new remote job, and I set about making our little fixer-upper into a home. It was at one of those endless town socials that I first met James. He stood out immediately, tall with a rugged charm that seemed at odds with the wholesome small-town vibe. Our eyes met across a sea of gingham and polo shirts, and I felt a jolt of electricity I hadn't experienced in years. "New in town?" he asked, sidling up to me at the punch bowl. His voice was deep, with a hint of gravel that sent shivers down my spine. I nodded, suddenly tongue-tied. "Sarah," I managed, extending my hand. "My husband and I just moved here last month." If the mention of my husband bothered him, he didn't show it. "James," he replied, his hand lingering on mine a moment too long. "Welcome to Millbrook. I have a feeling you're going to shake things up around here." I laughed, but there was an intensity in his gaze that made me both thrilled and uneasy. As I watched him walk away, I tried to shake off the feeling that something momentous had just occurred. Over the next few weeks, I found myself running into James everywhere. At the grocery store, the local coffee shop, even on my morning jogs. Each encounter left me feeling flushed and slightly breathless. I told myself it was harmless, just a little excitement to break up the monotony of small-town life. But then came the night of the summer festival. Mark was stuck on a work call, so I went alone. The streets were alive with music and laughter, strings of lights turning the town square into a magical wonderland. And there was James, looking devastatingly handsome in a simple white t-shirt and jeans. "Dance with me," he said, pulling me close before I could protest. The band was playing a slow, sultry tune, and as we swayed together, the rest of the world seemed to fade away. I don't know who moved first, but suddenly his lips were on mine. It was electric, passionate, everything I'd been missing. For a moment, I forgot about Mark, about our life together, about everything except the feel of James's arms around me. Then reality came crashing back. I pulled away, mumbling apologies, and fled into the night. My heart raced, torn between exhilaration and guilt. What had I done? The next morning, a bouquet of red roses arrived at our door. The card simply read, "Until next time." I hid them in the garage, my stomach churning with a mixture of desire and dread. I tried to avoid James after that, but it seemed impossible in such a small town. He was always there, his eyes following me, a knowing smile playing on his lips. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, our encounters became more frequent, more intense. A brush of hands at the farmer's market, a lingering glance across the church pews. Each time I felt myself being pulled deeper into his orbit. It was wrong, I knew that. I loved Mark. Our marriage wasn't perfect, but it was solid, built on years of trust and shared dreams. And yet I couldn't deny the thrill that coursed through me every time I saw James. One rainy afternoon, I ran into him at the bookstore. We got to talking about our favorite authors, and before I knew it, hours had passed. As we stood outside under the awning, watching the rain fall, he turned to me. "I can't stop thinking about you, Sarah," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I know you feel it too. We could be amazing together." I wanted to resist, to walk away, but instead, I found myself nodding. "Yes," I whispered, and then his lips were on mine again. What followed was a whirlwind of stolen moments and passionate encounters. We met in secret, always careful to avoid prying eyes. James was intoxicating, making me feel alive in ways I'd forgotten were possible. But with each clandestine meeting, the weight of my guilt grew heavier. It was Mark's worried face that finally snapped me out of it. "Are you okay, honey?" he asked one night, his brow furrowed with concern. "You seem distant lately." The genuine love and care in his eyes was like a bucket of cold water. What was I doing? I was throwing away a good man, a good life, for what? A fling? That night I ended things with James. It was harder than I expected. He didn't take it well. "You can't just walk away from this," he said, his eyes flashing with an emotion I couldn't quite place. "What we have is special." I stood my ground even as my heart ached. "It's over, James. I'm sorry, but I love my husband. This was a mistake. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong." The next day I found a note tucked under my windshield wiper. "I'm not giving up on us," it read. I crumpled it up, my hands shaking. But it didn't stop there. Texts from unknown numbers, hang-up calls in the middle of the night. Once I could have sworn I saw him standing outside our house just watching. Fear began to creep in, replacing the excitement I'd once felt. I changed my routines, always looking over my shoulder. But James seemed to be everywhere, his presence a constant, looming threat. One night I woke to the sound of breaking glass. Heart pounding, I shook Mark awake. "There's someone in the house," I whispered. We crept downstairs, Mark armed with a baseball bat. In the kitchen we found a broken window and muddy footprints leading to the back door. Nothing was taken, but on the fridge was a note. "You're mine." We called the police, but without concrete proof, there wasn't much they could do. "Probably just kids," the officer said, but the look he gave me said he didn't believe it any more than I did. The incidents escalated. My tires were slashed. Dead flowers were left on our porch. Each time the police were sympathetic but helpless. And through it all, James maintained his innocence, always with that same intense, unsettling smile. "You're being paranoid, Sarah," he said when I confronted him outside the grocery store. "I'm not doing anything. Maybe you're just feeling guilty about throwing away the best thing that ever happened to you." His words sent chills down my spine. There was a coldness in his eyes I'd never seen before, a glimpse of something dark and dangerous lurking beneath the charming exterior. I became a prisoner in my own home, jumping at every sound, afraid to go out alone. Mark was supportive, but I could see the strain it was putting on our marriage. The very thing I'd tried to protect by ending the affair was now being torn apart by its aftermath. It all came to a head on a stormy night in October. Mark was out of town for work and I was home alone. The power went out, plunging the house into darkness. As I fumbled for candles, I heard a noise from upstairs, a creak of floorboards that shouldn't have been there. My blood ran cold. I knew with a certainty that defied logic that James was in the house. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. Panic rising in my throat, I looked for a way out. But he was there, blocking the door, his silhouette illuminated by a flash of lightning. "We belong together, Sarah," he said, his voice eerily calm. "I'm not letting you go." What followed was a nightmare of cat and mouse through the darkened house. I managed to evade him, locking myself in the bathroom, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. As I heard him trying to break down the door, I realized with horrifying clarity the magnitude of my mistake. This man, whom I'd invited into my life with open arms, was now the greatest threat to my very existence. The sound of sirens cut through the storm. A neighbor, hearing the commotion, had called the police. James fled, but the damage was done. My sense of safety, of trust, lay shattered like the windows he'd broken. In the aftermath, we moved away from Millbrook, away from the idyllic small town that had become a prison of fear. I spent months in therapy, working through the guilt, the fear, the sheer stupidity of my actions. James was eventually caught and arrested, not just for his harassment of me, but for similar behavior with other women in town. The charming exterior had hidden a deeply disturbed individual, a predator who had been playing this game for years. Mark and I are still together, working to rebuild what was almost lost. Some days are harder than others. Trust, once broken, is not easily repaired, but we're trying, and that has to count for something. As for me, I've learned a hard lesson about the dangers that can lurk behind a charming smile and the high price of a moment's weakness. Every day I'm grateful for my second chance, and I live with the knowledge that things could have ended much, much worse. So if you ever find yourself tempted by the thrill of the forbidden, remember my story. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones we invite into our lives with open arms, and by the time we realize our mistake, it might be too late to escape. The library was supposed to be quiet, but the whispers I heard that night were anything but peaceful. What I discovered in that hidden room changed everything I thought I knew about reality. I've always been a night owl, which is why the graveyard shift at Miskatonic University's library suited me perfectly. The pay wasn't great, but the solitude gave me time to work on my thesis while keeping an eye on the occasionally rowdy student pulling an all-nighter. Plus, there was something comforting about being surrounded by all that knowledge, even if most of it gathered dust on rarely touched shelves. It was a Tuesday night, or Wednesday morning technically, when everything changed. The library was empty, save for a couple of grad students passed out in the far corner. I was making my usual rounds, reshelving books and straightening chairs, when I noticed something odd. A faint glow was coming from behind one of the bookshelves in the ancient history section. Now I knew every inch of this library, and there definitely wasn't supposed to be any light source back there. Curiosity piqued. I made my way over, the soft carpet muffling my footsteps. As I got closer, I realized the light was seeping through a crack between the shelving unit and the wall. Had someone left a flashlight on? But no, the quality of the light was all wrong. It pulsed and shifted, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. I ran my hand along the edge of the bookshelf, feeling for anything out of place. To my surprise, my fingers caught on a small hidden latch. With a soft click, the entire shelf swung outward like a door, revealing a narrow passageway beyond. My heart raced as I peered into the opening. This wasn't on any of the library floor plans I'd seen. The rational part of my brain said to close it up and call campus security. But a stronger, more primal part urged me forward. I'd always been too curious for my own good. Swallowing hard, I stepped into the passageway. The air was thick and musty, with an underlying scent I couldn't quite place, something ancient and vaguely metallic. The walls were lined with rough stone, and the floor sloped gently downward. The strange, pulsing light grew stronger as I descended. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, the passage opened up into a circular room. And what a room it was. My jaw dropped as I took in the scene before me. The walls were covered in intricate symbols and diagrams, some carved directly into the stone, others painted in what looked disturbingly like dried blood. Shelves lined the room, packed with books that looked far older than anything in the main library. But it was the center of the room that truly caught my attention. A pedestal stood there, and atop it sat an object that defied description. It seemed to shift and change as I looked at it, never quite settling on a single form. Sometimes it appeared as an ancient tome, its cover writhing with tentacles. Other times it was a crystalline structure that hurt my eyes to look at directly. And through it all, it pulsed with that same eerie light that had drawn me here. I approached cautiously, my curiosity overriding my growing sense of dread. As I got closer, I could hear it. Whispers, countless voices speaking in languages I'd never heard before. They seemed to be coming from the object itself, growing louder with each step I took. My hand reached out of its own accord, drawn to the shifting thing on the pedestal. Just before my fingers made contact, a voice cut through the whispers, clear as day. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." I spun around, my heart nearly leaping out of my chest. An old man stood in the doorway, his white hair wild and his eyes gleaming with an unsettling intensity. I recognized him vaguely, Professor Armitage from the Occult Studies Department. I'd seen him around campus, but never spoken to him directly. What is this place?" I managed to stammer out. Armitage stepped into the room, his gaze fixed on the object behind me. "This, my young friend, is where we keep the real knowledge, the kind the world isn't ready for." He proceeded to explain, in a maddeningly calm voice, that the university had been protecting and studying artifacts of great and terrible power for generations. This room, and others like it hidden throughout the campus, contained truths that could reshape or destroy our understanding of reality. "But why show me?" I asked, still struggling to process everything. "Why not just send me away?" Armitage's expression turned grim. "Because you found your way here, which means you're now a part of this, and we need all the help we can get." Over the next few hours, as the night gave way to dawn, Armitage gave me a crash course in eldritch horrors and cosmic truths. He spoke of ancient beings that slumbered beneath the earth and beyond the stars, of cults that sought to wake them, and of the thin veil that separated our reality from chaotic dimensions beyond imagining. My head spun with information overload, but one thing became clear. The world was a far stranger and more dangerous place than I'd ever realized. And now, whether I liked it or not, I was part of a secret group tasked with keeping that danger at bay. As the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the library's high windows, Armitage led me back to the hidden door. "Go home, get some rest," he said. "But be back here tomorrow night. There's much to learn, and time is not on our side." I nodded numbly, still reeling from everything I'd seen and heard. As I turned to leave, Armitage placed a hand on my shoulder. "And remember," he said, his voice low and urgent, "speak of this to no one. The fate of the world may depend on our secrecy." The next few weeks were a blur of nighttime lessons and mind-bending revelations. By day, I went through the motions of my normal life, attending classes and working on my thesis. But my nights were filled with ancient tomes, arcane rituals, and discussions of cosmic horrors that threatened to drive me mad. I learned to read languages that had been dead for millennia, and to recognize signs of otherworldly influence in everyday events. Armitage and the other members of what I came to know as the Library Guard taught me protective spells and how to shield my mind from psychic attacks. But it wasn't all academic. One night, about a month after my initial discovery, alarms blared throughout the hidden chambers. A group of cultists had broken into one of the other secret rooms on campus, attempting to steal an artifact that could open a portal to a dimension of pure chaos. Heart pounding, I followed Armitage and the others as we raced across the moonlit campus. We arrived just in time to see the cultists completing a ritual, a swirling vortex of energy forming in the air before them. What followed was like something out of a nightmare. We fought not just against the cultists, but against tentacled horrors that began to squeeze through the forming portal. I found myself chanting spells I'd only recently learned, my voice joining with the others to create a barrier of pure will against the encroaching madness. In the end, we managed to close the portal and subdue the cultists, but the cost was high. 2 of our group lay dead, their minds shattered by what they'd seen. And I would never be the same. As we stood there, panting and shell-shocked in the aftermath, Armitage turned to me with a grim smile. "Still sure you want to be a part of this?" he asked. I looked around at the destruction, at the bodies of both allies and enemies, at the scorch marks on the walls where reality itself had begun to fray. And despite the terror still coursing through my veins, I knew there was only one answer. "Someone has to do it," I said. "If not us, then who?" Armitage nodded, a mix of pride and sadness in his eyes. "Welcome to the Library Guard, kid. The hours are hell, the pay is non-existent, and the retirement plan is probably an early grave or a padded cell. but we're the only thing standing between humanity and utter annihilation. As we made our way back to the library to clean up and debrief, I couldn't help but think about how much my life had changed in just a few short weeks. The quiet night security job I'd taken to help pay for grad school had turned into a frontline position in a secret war against cosmic horrors. I thought about the students peacefully sleeping in their dorms, the professors preparing lectures on mundane subjects, the world going about its business in blissful ignorance, and I realized that ignorance truly was bliss. But knowledge, terrible as it might be, was power, and we needed all the power we could get. So now, when you see me shelving books or shushing noisy students, know that there's more going on than meets the eye. The library is still quiet, but the whispers never truly stop. And in the hidden rooms beneath your feet, a battle rages to keep reality itself intact. Sweet dreams, and pray you never have to wake up to the truth I live with every day. The screams echoed through the forest, turning our peaceful camping trip into a waking nightmare. We thought we were alone in the wilderness, but something sinister was lurking in the shadows, waiting to make us its prey. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway. Just me and my 4 best friends from college, reuniting for our annual camping trip. We'd been doing this for years, ever since graduation, but this time we decided to try a new spot. Jake had heard about a secluded area deep in the national forest, far from the usual tourist trails. "It'll be an adventure," he said. If only we'd known what kind of adventure we were in for. We arrived late Friday afternoon, the sun already dipping low behind the trees. The drive-in had been rough, our SUV bouncing along overgrown logging roads until we finally found a suitable clearing to set up camp. As we pitched our tents and gathered firewood, I couldn't shake a nagging feeling of unease. The forest seemed too quiet, the shadows between the trees too deep. "Relax, Alex," Lisa said, noticing my tense expression. "You're just not used to being this far from civilization. Enjoy the peace and quiet." I forced a smile and nodded, but the knot in my stomach refused to unwind. As night fell, we gathered around the campfire, passing around beers and swapping stories like we always did. Yet even as we laughed and reminisced, I found myself constantly glancing into the darkness beyond our little circle of light. It was close to midnight when we heard it. A scream, distant but unmistakable, cutting through the night air like a knife. We all froze, our laughter dying in our throats. "What the hell was that?" Mike whispered, his eyes wide. "Probably just a mountain lion," Jake said, but his voice lacked conviction. "They can sound pretty human sometimes." We listened intently, but the forest had fallen silent again. Slowly, conversation resumed, though more subdued than before. I could see the others casting furtive glances into the woods, just as I had been doing all night. As we were about to turn in, we heard it again, closer this time, and undeniably human. A scream of pure terror that made my blood run cold. "That's no animal," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "Someone's in trouble out there." We debated what to do. The smart thing would have been to stay put, to call for help on the satellite phone we'd brought for emergencies. But the screams continued, growing more desperate, and we knew we couldn't just sit there and do nothing. Armed with flashlights and a couple of hunting knives, we set out into the dark forest. The beam of my flashlight seemed pathetically inadequate against the vast darkness surrounding us. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. We'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when Mike suddenly stopped short. "Guys," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Look." His flashlight beam illuminated something on the ground, a scrap of fabric, torn and blood-stained. A few feet beyond it, we found a shoe, then another piece of cloth. It was like following a grotesque trail of breadcrumbs. The screaming had stopped, which somehow made everything worse. The silence pressed in on us, broken only by our ragged breathing and pounding hearts. We pushed on, deeper into the woods. The trail of discarded items continued, becoming more frequent, and then we smelled it, a sickly sweet odor that turned my stomach. As we rounded a large boulder, our lights fell upon a sight that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. It was a clearing, but unlike any natural formation. The ground had been cleared in a perfect circle, the earth packed down and marked with strange symbols. At its center stood a crude altar, little more than a flat stone slab raised on pillars of stacked rocks. And on that altar, I'll spare you the details of what we saw. Suffice it to say, we found the source of the screams, though they would never scream again. Sarah retched, doubling over. Jake cursed under his breath. I stood frozen, my mind refusing to process the horror before me. That's when we heard the chanting. It started low, almost subliminal, but quickly grew in volume. Figures emerged from the trees, cloaked in dark robes, their faces hidden in deep hoods. There must have been at least 24 of them, forming a circle around us before we could even think to run. Well, well, a voice rang out, smooth and cultured, entirely at odds with the barbaric scene. It seems we have some uninvited guests. A figure stepped forward, lowering his hood. He was older, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to glow in the moonlight. His smile was pleasant, almost fatherly, but there was a coldness behind it that made my skin crawl. We don't often get visitors out here, he continued. The energies of this place tend to discourage wanderers. But you, my young friends, you heard our call and came. How wonderfully brave of you. Call? Lisa managed to choke out. Those were screams. You killed someone. The man's smile never wavered. A necessary sacrifice, I'm afraid. The old ones demand tribute, and who are we to deny them? But now that you're here, well, I think they'll be quite pleased with the bounty we can offer tonight. It happened so fast. The cultists surged forward, grabbing us before we could react. I felt rough hands seizing my arms, a sharp pain as something pricked my neck. The world began to spin, voices becoming distant and distorted. I fought against the encroaching darkness, struggled to keep my eyes open. The last thing I saw before unconsciousness took me was the old man's face. Those cold blue eyes staring into mine as he spoke words I couldn't understand. I awoke to the sound of dripping water. My head pounded, my mouth dry as sand. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized I was in some kind of cave. The others were there too, still unconscious, bound hand and foot like I was. Fear and adrenaline helped clear the fog from my mind. I worked at my bonds, ignoring the pain as the rough rope bit into my wrists. After what felt like hours, I managed to free one hand, then the other. I quickly untied my ankles and moved to help my friends. One by one they stirred, groggy and disoriented. We spoke in whispers, piecing together what had happened. None of us knew how long we'd been out or where exactly we were. All we knew was that we had to get out before those cultists came back. The cave had only one entrance, sealed by a heavy wooden door. It was locked, of course, but years of rock climbing had taught me a thing or two about problem solving. Using a broken piece of stalagmite and some shoelaces, I managed to create a crude lockpick. It took several tense minutes, but finally we heard the beautiful sound of the lock clicking open. We crept through dark, twisting tunnels, every shadow seeming to hide potential danger. Eventually, we saw a faint glow ahead, moonlight filtering in through an opening. Freedom was so close we could taste it, but as we approached the cave mouth, we heard voices. The cultists were out there, dozens of them engaged in some kind of ritual. Their chanting echoed off the cave walls, the words in no language I recognized, but filling me with a sense of creeping dread. We huddled in the shadows, trying to formulate a plan. That's when we saw it, a shape in the sky, descending towards the gathered cultists. It was huge, defying description, its form seeming to shift and change as it moved. All I know is that looking at it filled me with a terror so profound, so primal, that I thought I might lose my mind. "We have to go," I whispered urgently. Now, while they're distracted, we made a break for it, sprinting past the oblivious cultists and into the woods beyond. Behind us, we heard shouts of alarm, then sounds that I can only describe as otherworldly, a cacophony of shrieks and roars that seemed to come from everywhere at once. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs felt like jelly. Somehow, miraculously, we found our way back to our campsite. We piled into the SUV, not even bothering to grab our gear, and tore out of there like bats out of hell. It wasn't until we hit the main highway, the first glimmers of dawn breaking on the horizon, that we finally felt safe enough to stop. We pulled over at a rest area and just sat there in silence, each of us trying to process what we'd been through. What do we do now?" Sarah finally asked, her voice small and scared. I thought about it for a long moment. "We go to the police," I said. "We tell them everything." And we did, but of course they didn't believe us. How could they? Our story sounded insane, even to our own ears. They found our campsite untouched except for some animal tracks. No sign of any cult activity, no mysterious cave, nothing to corroborate our tale. In the end, we were left with nothing but our memories and the nightmares that followed. We don't go camping anymore, at least not together. Some friendships can't survive the weight of shared trauma, of knowing things we were never meant to know. But sometimes, on dark nights when the wind howls just right, I swear I can still hear those chants, still see that shape descending from the sky. And I wonder, with a mixture of dread and morbid curiosity, what might have happened if we hadn't escaped. What horrors await in those deep, dark woods, and how long before they spill out into the world beyond? So if you're ever camping in the wilderness and you hear screams in the night, don't investigate. Don't try to help, just run. Run as fast and as far as you can. Because some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some darknesses should never see the light of day. The headlights in my rearview mirror were relentless, growing larger with each passing second. What started as an ordinary drive home turned into a terrifying game of cat and mouse on a lonely stretch of highway. It was just past midnight when I left the office. I'd been burning the midnight oil, trying to finish a project before the weekend. The roads were empty, a rarity in our usually bustling city. I was looking forward to getting home, maybe having a glass of wine, and finally relaxing. As I merged onto the highway, I noticed a pair of headlights behind me. Nothing unusual about that, I thought. But as the minutes ticked by, I realized the car wasn't just going in the same direction. It was matching my every move. When I changed lanes, it changed lanes. When I slowed down, it slowed down. When I sped up, trying to put some distance between us, it accelerated to match. A knot of unease began to form in my stomach. I tried to get a better look at the driver in my rearview mirror, but the glare from the headlights made it impossible. All I could see was a dark silhouette, featureless and menacing. "You're being paranoid," I muttered to myself. "It's just someone going the same way. Relax." But I couldn't relax. Every instinct I had was screaming that something was wrong. I decided to test my theory. At the next exit, I signaled and took the off-ramp at the last second. The car behind me swerved sharply, cutting across 2 lanes of traffic to follow me. My heart leaped into my throat. This was no coincidence. I accelerated, hoping to lose them in the unfamiliar side streets. But they stayed right on my tail, their engine roaring as they kept pace. I took random turns, my palms sweating on the steering wheel, but nothing I did seemed to shake them. As I barreled down a residential street, the car behind me suddenly sped up. With a sickening crunch, they rammed into my rear bumper. I screamed, fighting to keep control as my car fishtailed. "What do you want?" I yelled, knowing they couldn't hear me but unable to contain my fear and frustration. I managed to straighten out, but now the game had changed. This wasn't just following anymore. This was an attack. I had to get help. I fumbled for my phone, trying to keep one eye on the road and one on my pursuer. But as I went to dial 911, I realized with horror that I had no signal. Of course, we were in a dead zone, miles from the nearest cell tower. The car rammed me again, harder this time. I felt my back tires leave the ground for a terrifying moment before slamming back down. Ahead, I saw the road curved sharply. If they hit me again on that turn... At the last second, I yanked the wheel hard, swerving onto a dirt road I'd barely noticed. My pursuer, caught off guard, shot past me. I heard the squeal of brakes as they tried to correct, but it was too late. Their momentum carried them into a ditch. I should have felt relief, but I knew this was far from over. I accelerated down the dirt road, not caring where it led as long as it was away from here. Dust billowed behind me, obscuring my view of anything that might be following. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I saw lights ahead. A gas station, its fluorescent glow a beacon of hope in the darkness. I pulled in, tires screeching, and practically fell out of my car. The attendant, a bored-looking teenager, glanced up from his phone. His eyes widened as he took in my disheveled appearance and the state of my car. "Please," I gasped. "I need help. Someone's after me. Can I use your phone?" He nodded, reaching under the counter for an ancient landline. As I dialed 911 with shaking fingers, I heard the roar of an engine approaching. "They're coming," I whispered, panic rising in my throat. The attendant, to his credit, acted quickly. He ushered me behind the counter and hit a button that locked the store's doors. We crouched down, peering over the edge of the counter as a car pulled into the lot. It was a dark sedan, nondescript except for the crumpled front end, evidence of our earlier collision. The driver's door opened slowly, and a figure emerged. In the harsh fluorescent light, I finally got a good look at my pursuer. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a black hoodie pulled low over his face. He stalked towards the store, his movements predatory and purposeful. When he reached the doors and found them locked, he began to pound on the glass. The whole store seemed to shake with each impact. "Come out," he shouted, his voice muffled but unmistakably angry. "I know you're in there." The attendant and I huddled closer together, neither of us daring to make a sound. I could hear the 911 operator on the phone, assuring me that help was on the way. But would it arrive in time? The pounding stopped abruptly. For a moment I thought maybe he'd given up. Then I heard a new sound, the tinkling of breaking glass. He was smashing the door. "We need to run," the attendant whispered urgently. "There's a back door through the stockroom." We crawled towards the rear of the store, the sound of shattering glass spurring us on. Just as we reached the stockroom door, I heard the crunch of boots on broken glass. He was inside. We raced through the stockroom, knocking over boxes in our haste. Behind us, I could hear him cursing, the sound of items being thrown aside as he searched for us. The back door was mercifully unlocked. We burst out into the cool night air, gulping it down in desperate breaths. In the distance, I could hear sirens approaching. Help was almost here, but our pursuer was closer. The door banged open behind us and I heard a roar of rage. Without looking back, I ran. The attendant and I split up, him heading towards the road while I made for a wooded area behind the station. I could hear heavy footsteps behind me, getting closer with each second. He'd chosen to follow me. The woods were dark, the ground uneven. I stumbled over roots and rocks, branches whipping at my face as I ran blindly forward. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but terror kept me moving. Suddenly, the ground disappeared from under me. I tumbled down a steep embankment, rocks and twigs tearing at my clothes and skin. When I finally came to a stop, I lay there for a moment, dazed and winded. Then I heard it, the sound of someone sliding down the embankment after me. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the pain that shot through my body. But I'd only taken a few steps when a hand grabbed my ankle, yanking me back. I fell hard, the breath knocked out of me. As I gasped for air, I was roughly flipped onto my back. The man loomed over me, his face finally visible in the moonlight that filtered through the trees. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe in his early 30s. His features were twisted with rage, his eyes wild and unfocused. In his hand, he held a wicked-looking knife. "Why?" I managed to choke out. "Why are you doing this?" For a moment, confusion flickered across his face. Then he laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Why? Because you cut me off back on the highway. Nobody disrespects me like that." I stared at him in disbelief. All of this, the chase, the terror, the violence, over something so trivial, something I didn't even remember doing. Before I could respond, the woods were suddenly illuminated by flashing lights. The sirens, which had faded into the background of my panic, were now deafeningly close. The man's head snapped up, his eyes widening in fear. For a second, he seemed frozen, unsure whether to finish what he'd started or run. That moment of hesitation was all I needed. I kicked out hard, catching him in the knee. He stumbled backwards with a cry of pain, the knife falling from his grasp. I scrambled to my feet and ran towards the lights, towards safety. Behind me, I could hear shouts and the crashing of underbrush as the police gave chase. When I finally emerged from the woods, I was immediately surrounded by officers. They wrapped me in a blanket, asked if I was hurt, told me I was safe now. As the adrenaline wore off, I began to shake uncontrollably. They caught him, of course. He didn't get far, not with a whole squad of police on his tail. As they led him away in handcuffs, our eyes met for a brief moment. The rage was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like confusion, as if he couldn't quite believe what he'd done. In the days and weeks that followed, I learned more about my attacker. He had a history of road rage incidents, each one escalating in violence. I was just the latest in a string of victims, but I was the first he'd pursued for so long, so relentlessly. The legal proceedings were a blur of statements and testimonies. He was sentenced to years in prison, but that brought me little comfort. The real sentence was the one I was serving. jumping at every sound, unable to drive at night, constantly looking over my shoulder. It's been months now, and I'm slowly putting my life back together. Therapy helps, as does the support of friends and family, but I know I'll never be the same. That night changed me, showed me how quickly ordinary life can spiral into terror, how thin the veneer of civilization really is. So the next time you're driving and someone cuts you off, take a deep breath and let it go, because you never know what's going on in someone else's mind, what demons they're wrestling with, and you never know when a moment of anger might turn into a nightmare that changes lives forever. As for me, I still drive that same stretch of highway sometimes. But now, when I see headlights in my rearview mirror, I can't help but wonder, is it happening again? And if it is, will I be strong enough, lucky enough to survive a second time? The first time I saw a man's face melt, I knew our quiet little town was doomed. What started as an exciting move to a charming community quickly spiraled into a nightmare of mad science and unspeakable horrors. My wife Emily and I had been searching for a place to settle down and start a family. When we stumbled upon Millbrook, it seemed perfect. Picturesque streets lined with oak trees, friendly neighbors, and a sense of community you just don't find in the city. The old Victorian house we bought needed some work, but I was handy enough to tackle most of it. Our first few weeks in Millbrook were idyllic. We painted rooms, planted a garden, and got to know our neighbors. Everyone was welcoming, if a bit reserved. There was an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Meaningful glances exchanged between longtime residents, conversations that stopped abruptly when we approached. I chalked it up to small-town wariness of newcomers. That is, until the night I saw Old Man Jenkins walking home from the market. I was out for an evening jog when I spotted him across the street. I waved, about to call out a greeting, when something changed. His face seemed to ripple like heat waves off hot asphalt. Then, to my horror, it began to sag, skin dripping off his skull like candle wax. I blinked hard, sure I was hallucinating. When I looked again, Jenkins was normal, continuing down the sidewalk as if nothing had happened. I stood there, heart racing, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. That night, I tossed and turned, the image of Jenkins' melting face playing on repeat in my mind. I didn't tell Emily. How could I? She'd think I was losing it. The next morning, I ran into our neighbor Sarah while getting the mail. "Everything okay?" she asked, brow furrowed with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I hesitated, then found myself spilling the whole story. To my surprise, Sarah didn't seem shocked. Instead, her face paled and she glanced nervously up and down the street. "Come inside," she said, ushering me into her house. Once the door was locked behind us, she turned to me with a grim expression. "What I'm about to tell you is going to sound crazy, but I swear it's true." Over the next hour, Sarah revealed Millbrook's dark secret. The town had been home to a brilliant but unethical scientist named Dr. Elliot Thorne. For years, he'd been conducting experiments on unwitting townspeople, testing serums designed to enhance human abilities and extend life. At first, the effects seemed miraculous, Sarah explained. People got stronger, healthier. But then, things started to go wrong. The mutations began slowly. Enhanced reflexes turning into uncontrollable spasms, improved eyesight leading to painful sensitivity to light, and in some cases, like what I'd witnessed with Jenkins, complete cellular instability. The town council tried to shut Thorne down, Sarah continued, but by then, half the population had been exposed. He threatened to withhold the treatments that were keeping people alive if they turned him in. I sat there stunned. It was like something out of a sci-fi horror movie, not the quaint small town we'd moved to. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Because it's getting worse. People are dying or changing into things that aren't human anymore. We need help, but we can't risk outside attention. The government would quarantine us all." I left Sarah's house in a daze, my mind reeling. Part of me wanted to grab Emily and run, to put Millbrook in our rearview mirror and never look back. But I knew I couldn't abandon these people. They needed help, and for some reason, Sarah had decided to trust me. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into research, using my background in chemistry to try and understand Thorne's work. Emily noticed my distraction, my late nights poring over medical journals and genetics textbooks. I hated lying to her, but I couldn't bring her into this nightmare. Not yet. It was on one of these late nights that I heard a commotion outside. I peered out the window to see a group of people gathered around something in the street. As I watched, horrified, I realized it was a person, or what used to be a person. Their body was grotesquely misshapen, limbs elongated and twisted at impossible angles. I grabbed my coat and rushed outside, caution overridden by a need to help. As I approached, I recognized one of the onlookers as Dr. Hannigan, the town's only physician. "What's happening?" I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. Hannigan turned to me, his face grim. "It's progression," he said quietly. "Stage 3 mutation. There's nothing we can do except make them comfortable." I watched in horror as Hannigan produced a syringe filled with clear liquid. The twisted figure on the ground let out a keening wail as the needle pierced their skin. Within moments, they went still. That was the night everything changed. I couldn't keep the secret from Emily any longer. Through tears, I told her everything. What I'd seen, what Sarah had told me, the horrible truth of our new home. To my surprise, after the initial shock wore off, Emily's response was one of determination. "We have to help them," she said, squeezing my hand. "Whatever it takes." With Emily's support, I redoubled my efforts to understand Thorne's research. We converted our basement into a makeshift lab, working tirelessly to develop a cure, or at least a way to halt the mutations. Weeks turned into months. The situation in Millbrook deteriorated rapidly. More and more people succumbed to the later stages of mutation. Those still holding on lived in constant fear of what they might become. We had a breakthrough when we managed to synthesize a compound that seemed to stabilize cellular degradation in lab samples. But we needed more data, more resources. That's when we made the difficult decision to reach out to an old colleague of mine at the CDC. We knew it was risky. If word got out about what was happening in Millbrook, the consequences would be dire. But we were running out of time and options. Dr. Amelia Chen arrived under the guise of investigating a rare fungal outbreak. With her help, we made rapid progress. We were on the verge of a viable treatment when disaster struck. I was working late in the lab when I heard glass shattering upstairs. I raced up to find our living room in chaos. Furniture overturned, papers scattered everywhere. And Emily? Emily was gone. A note was pinned to the wall with a scalpel. "You should have left well enough alone. The work must continue." E.T. Thorne had Emily. The next 48 hours were a blur of panic and desperate searching. The town mobilized, those still able-bodied combing every inch of Millbrook for any sign of Emily or Thorne. We found them in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Thorne had converted it into a grotesque laboratory, filled with cages containing things that used to be human. And there was Emily, strapped to a table, Thorne looming over her with a syringe of sickly green liquid. What followed was chaos. In the struggle to save Emily, vials were knocked over, mysterious chemicals mixing on the floor. A fire broke out, spreading rapidly through the dry timber of the old building. We managed to get Emily and as many of Thorne's victims as we could to safety. But Thorne himself, along with his research, was lost to the flames. In the aftermath, we worked tirelessly to administer the treatment we'd developed. It wasn't a cure, but it halted the mutations, giving the people of Millbrook a chance at something resembling a normal life. The official story was a chemical spill and fire that caused widespread illness. The CDC contained it, the government paid for ongoing medical care, and Millbrook slowly began to heal. But those of us who know the truth will never forget. The scars, physical and emotional, run deep. Every time I look at Emily, I'm reminded of how close we came to losing everything. Millbrook is quiet now, peaceful even. But sometimes late at night, I swear I can hear distant screams echoing from the woods. And I wonder, did we really see the last of Dr. Thorne? Or is he out there somewhere, continuing his twisted work? One thing's for certain, I'll never look at a small town the same way again. Because you never know what secrets might be lurking behind those picket fences and friendly smiles. Sometimes the most horrifying monsters are the ones we create ourselves. The crystal-clear waters of the Bahamas turned dark with menace the moment we stumbled upon their secret cove. What started as a carefree day of jet skiing became a desperate fight for survival against an enemy we never saw coming. It was our third day in paradise. My girlfriend Mia and I had been saving for this vacation for months, determined to make the most of every sun-soaked minute. We'd spent the first couple of days lounging on the beach, sipping fruity cocktails, and generally letting the stress of our regular lives melt away under the tropical sun. But today we were feeling adventurous. We'd rented a pair of jet skis, eager to explore the coastline and maybe find a secluded spot for a private picnic. The rental guy gave us a map, pointing out the best areas and warning us about some shallow reefs to avoid. "Stay within sight of the resort," he advised with a friendly smile. "It's easy to get turned around out there." We nodded, only half listening. We were too excited about the prospect of zipping across those impossibly blue waters to pay much attention to warnings. For the first hour or so, it was everything we'd hoped for. The wind in our hair, the spray of the sea on our faces, the thrill of speed as we raced each other from one picturesque cove to another. We were living in a postcard and loving every second of it. It was Mia who spotted it first, a narrow opening in the cliffs that lined the shore, barely visible unless you were looking right at it. "Let's check it out," she called over the roar of the jet ski's engines. I hesitated for a moment. We drifted pretty far from the resort, and that little voice in the back of my head was reminding me of the rental guy's warning. But Mia's excited grin was infectious, and my own curiosity got the better of me. "All right," I shouted back. "But just a quick look." We maneuvered our jet skis through the opening, the cliffs rising up on either side of us like ancient guardians. The passage widened, revealing a hidden cove that took our breath away. Pristine white sand bordered crystal clear water, so still it looked like glass. It was like we'd discovered our own private piece of heaven. We beached the jet skis and waded ashore, marveling at the untouched beauty surrounding us. "Can you believe this?" Mia said, her eyes wide with wonder. "It's like no one's ever been here before." But as we explored the small beach, an uneasy feeling began to creep over me. There was something off about this place. The silence was too complete, the stillness too perfect. It felt less like paradise and more like a carefully constructed set. That's when I noticed the first red flag. Literally. Half buried in the sand near the tree line was a scrap of red fabric. As I bent to examine it, I realized it was part of a life jacket, torn and stained with what looked disturbingly like blood. "Mia," I called out, my voice tight. "I think we should go." But Mia wasn't listening. She was staring at something in the water, her face pale. "Jake," she whispered. "Look." I followed her gaze and felt my blood run cold. Just beneath the surface of that impossibly clear water, I could make out the dark shape of a sunken boat, and it wasn't alone. As my eyes adjusted, I could see other shapes, more boats, some jet skis, even what looked like a small plane. This wasn't a secluded paradise, it was a graveyard. Before I could process what I was seeing, the relative quiet was shattered by the roar of approaching engines. 3 speedboats appeared at the entrance to the cove, cutting off our escape route. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Mia's hand and pulling her towards the trees. We'd barely made it a few steps when a bullet kicked up sand at our feet. "That's far enough," a voice called out. "Hands where we can see them." Heart pounding, we turned to face our captors. 6 men had disembarked from the boats, all armed, all looking at us with a mixture of annoyance and cold calculation that made my skin crawl. One of them, a tall man with a jagged scar running down his cheek, approached us. "Well, well," he said, his accent a mix of local island lilt and something harder, more European. "What do we have here? A couple of lovebirds who flew a little too far from the nest?" "We're sorry," I stammered. "We didn't mean to trespass. We were just exploring and—" The man cut me off with a laugh that held no humor. "Exploring," he says. "Tell me, boy, what exactly do you think you've discovered here?" I glanced at Mia, seeing my own fear reflected in her eyes. "Nothing," I said quickly. "We haven't seen anything. We'll just get back on our jet skis and go. You'll never see us again." The scarred man shook his head, clicking his tongue in mock disappointment. "I'm afraid it's not that simple. You see, this little cove of ours, it's a secret, and we go to great lengths to keep it that way." As he spoke, his men began unloading large crates from the boats. With growing horror, I realized what we'd stumbled into. This was a smuggling operation, using the hidden cove as a transfer point for who knows what. Drugs, weapons, maybe even people. "Please," Mia said, her voice shaking. "We won't tell anyone. We swear. The leader regarded us for a long moment, his cold eyes seeming to look right through us. I believe you, he said finally. I truly do, but you see, we can't take that risk. Nothing personal, you understand. It's just business. He nodded to one of his men who raised his gun. I closed my eyes, waiting for the shot that would end it all. But instead of gunfire, I heard a sudden commotion and shouts of alarm. My eyes flew open to see absolute chaos erupting around us. A Coast Guard cutter had appeared at the mouth of the cove, and more boats were rapidly approaching. The smugglers scattered, some diving for their weapons while others made a break for their boats. In the confusion, I grabbed Mia's hand and ran. We sprinted for our jet skis, bullets whizzing past us as both the smugglers and the Coast Guard opened fire. I've never started an engine so fast in my life. We roared out of the cove, pushing the jet skis to their limits. I could hear the sounds of the firefight behind us, but I didn't dare look back. All that mattered was getting as far away from that nightmare as possible. It wasn't until we were within sight of our resort that we finally slowed down. My arms ached from gripping the handlebars so tightly, and my heart was still racing. Mia pulled up alongside me, her face streaked with tears and sea spray. Are you okay? I asked, reaching out to touch her arm. She nodded, managing a shaky smile. I think so. Jake, what just happened? I shook my head, still trying to process it all myself. I don't know, but I think we just had a very close call. We returned the jet skis and headed straight for our room, both of us badly shaken. As we walked through the lobby, we overheard excited chatter about a major drug bust that had just gone down. Apparently, the Coast Guard had been tracking the smuggling ring for months and had finally caught them in the act. Later that night, as we sat on our balcony watching the sunset, a sense of unreality washed over me. Just hours ago, we'd been staring death in the face. Now here we were, sipping cocktails and trying to act like normal tourists. Should we tell someone? Mia asked, breaking the long silence between us. About what we saw, I mean. I considered it for a moment before shaking my head. I don't think so. The Coast Guard got their bust. Anything we say would just complicate things and probably get us in trouble for being somewhere we shouldn't have been. Mia nodded, looking relieved. You're right, let's just try to enjoy the rest of our vacation. But we both knew things had changed. The rest of our trip was subdued, the carefree joy of those first few days replaced by a constant undercurrent of anxiety. Every time we went near the water, I found myself scanning the horizon, half expecting to see those speedboats coming for us. We've been home for a month now, and life has mostly returned to normal. But sometimes, late at night, I'll jolt awake from dreams of hidden coves and men with cold eyes and guns. In those moments, I'm acutely aware of how fragile our sense of safety really is, how quickly an ordinary day can turn into a fight for survival. Mia and I are still together, our bond strengthened by our shared ordeal. We don't talk about it much, but sometimes I'll catch her staring out at the ocean with a faraway look in her eyes, and I know she's thinking about it too. We're planning another vacation for next year. This time, we're thinking mountains, somewhere landlocked, far from any hidden coves or crystal clear waters that might be hiding dark secrets beneath the surface. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that paradise can turn into a nightmare in the blink of an eye, and some adventures are best left undiscovered. The mirror showed 2 reflections, but only one was mine. That's when I knew our romantic getaway had turned into a nightmare. It was supposed to be a second honeymoon of sorts. After 5 years of marriage, the spark between Sarah and me had dimmed a bit. We both worked demanding jobs, and quality time together had become a rare luxury. So when I stumbled upon a great deal for a week-long stay at the historic Blackwood Hotel, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to reconnect. The Blackwood had quite a reputation. Built in the 1920s, it had hosted everyone from Hollywood stars to notorious gangsters. The website boasted of its old-world charm with modern amenities, and the photos showcased elegant furnishings and sweeping views of the surrounding mountains. We arrived late on a Friday evening, the sun already dipping behind the peaks. The hotel was impressive, a sprawling Victorian mansion that loomed against the darkening sky. As we pulled up to the entrance, I felt a slight shiver run down my spine. I chalked it up to excitement and the chill in the air. The lobby was everything the website had promised. All polished wood, gleaming brass, and plush carpets. But there was something off about it. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive, and the smile of the clerk behind the desk seemed a bit too fixed. "Welcome to the Blackwood," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. "We hope you enjoy your stay." As she handed us our key cards, her fingers brushed against mine. They were ice cold, and I could have sworn I felt a small static shock. I pulled my hand back quickly, earning a questioning look from Sarah. "You okay?" she asked as we headed for the elevators. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just tired from the drive. Let's check out our room." We were on the 13th floor, of course we were. As the elevator climbed, I noticed Sarah fidgeting with her necklace, a nervous habit she'd had since college. "Honey?" I said, reaching for her hand. "Everything all right?" She startled slightly, as if pulled from deep thought. "What?" "Oh yes, I don't know. Something feels strange." I was about to agree when the elevator dinged, doors sliding open to reveal our floor. The hallway stretched out before us, the wallpaper a faded floral pattern that seemed to shift and move in my peripheral vision. Our room was at the far end. As I slid the key card into the lock, I heard a faint whisper. I turned, but the hallway was empty. "Did you hear that?" I asked Sarah. She shook her head, looking concerned. "Hear what?" The lock clicked, and we stepped into our home for the next week. The room was spacious and well-appointed, with a large four-poster bed dominating the space. A set of French doors led out to a small balcony overlooking the mountains. "Well, this is nice," Sarah said, but her tone lacked conviction. I moved to open the balcony doors, hoping some fresh air would dispel the unease we both seemed to be feeling. As I reached for the handle, I caught a glimpse of movement in the large mirror hanging on the wall. I turned, but there was nothing there except Sarah unpacking her suitcase. I shook my head, blaming my imagination and fatigue from the long drive. That first night was unsettling. The bed was comfortable enough, but I tossed and turned, plagued by vivid, disturbing dreams. I woke several times, convinced I heard whispers or footsteps in the room, but each time all I saw was Sarah sleeping peacefully beside me. The next morning, things seemed better. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and the heaviness I'd felt the night before had lifted somewhat. We enjoyed a leisurely breakfast in the hotel's ornate dining room, then set out to explore the nearby town. It was as we were getting ready for dinner that evening that things took a turn for the truly bizarre. I was adjusting my tie in the mirror when I noticed something strange in the reflection. For just a moment, I could have sworn I saw someone standing behind me, a woman in an old-fashioned dress, her face pale and eyes dark. I whirled around, heart pounding, but the room was empty save for Sarah, who was putting on her earrings at the vanity. "Dan?" she said, noticing my expression. "What's wrong?" I hesitated, not wanting to sound crazy. "Nothing," I said finally. "Just thought I saw something. Trick of the light, probably." But as we left the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Dinner was a tense affair. The food was excellent, but conversation was stilted. We both seemed on edge, jumping at small noises and glancing nervously around the dimly lit restaurant. Back in our room, Sarah finally broke. "Dan, I don't like this place," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Something's not right here." I wanted to comfort her, to tell her she was imagining things, but I couldn't, because I felt it too, a growing sense of wrongness that seemed to permeate the very air around us. "Maybe we should leave," I suggested. "Find a different hotel." Sarah nodded eagerly, relief evident on her face. But when I tried to call the front desk to check out, the phone was dead. My cell phone showed no signal. "Okay," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "Let's just pack up and go. We can sort out the bill later." We threw our things haphazardly into our suitcases, both of us eager to be gone. But when I tried to open the door, it wouldn't budge. The handle turned, but it was as if something on the other side was holding it shut. "This isn't happening," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. I was about to try ramming the door with my shoulder when we heard it, a soft melodic humming coming from the bathroom. We turned in unison to see the door slowly swinging open. Sarah clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Dan," she said, her voice barely audible. "I shut that door. I know I did." Heart pounding, I approached the bathroom. Steam billowed out, though we hadn't used the shower since that morning. And there, in the fog-covered mirror, was a message written in a delicate, old-fashioned script. "Welcome home." I stumbled backward, nearly knocking Sarah over. "We need to get out of here. Now." We tried the balcony doors, but they too were locked, the key missing from its usual spot. Sarah was openly crying now, and I wasn't far behind. This couldn't be happening. It had to be some kind of elaborate prank or shared hallucination. A loud knock on the door made us both jump. "Room service," a cheery voice called out. We exchanged confused glances. We hadn't ordered anything. "We didn't order room service," I called back, my voice shaking. There was a pause. Then the voice came again, lower this time. All cheer gone. "Oh, but you did. You always do." The door swung open, revealing not a hotel employee, but the woman I'd seen in the mirror earlier. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes, which were black as coal. "You're right on schedule," she said, gliding into the room. "You always arrive on this day, always try to leave on the next. But you can't, you see. You're part of the Blackwood now. Just like me." Sarah screamed, the sound piercing the unnatural quiet that had fallen over the room. I tried to put myself between her and the whatever this thing was, but my legs wouldn't move. The woman, no, the entity, laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "Oh, don't worry. It won't hurt much, and soon you won't even remember your old lives. You'll be happy here, I promise." As she spoke, the room began to change. The modern furnishings faded away, replaced by antiques. Our clothes transformed, Sarah's jeans and sweater becoming a flapper-style dress, my slacks and shirt turning into a pinstriped suit. I tried to speak, to protest, but no sound came out. I looked at Sarah, seeing my own terror reflected in her eyes. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. But it was. The entity smiled again, gesturing towards the door, which now opened onto a bustling 1920s hotel lobby. "Shall we? The rest of the guests are waiting to meet you." As we stepped through that door, I felt the last vestiges of our old lives slipping away. We were part of the Blackwood now, trapped in an eternal loop of arrival and forgotten departure. Sometimes, late at night, I catch glimpses of our true selves in the mirrors that hang throughout the hotel. In those moments, I remember who we were, what we've lost. But then, the music starts up again. The ghostly laughter echoes through the halls, and we're swept back into the endless party that is the Blackwood. If you ever find yourself driving by an old Victorian hotel in the mountains, think twice before booking a room. Because some places don't just hide secrets, they collect souls. And once you check in, you might never truly check out. The moment I picked up that hitchhiker, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. His eyes gleamed with a madness that turned my lonely drive into a highway to hell. I'd been on the road for nearly 14 hours straight, the monotony of the highway broken only by the occasional gas station stop and the changing colors of the sky as day faded into night. This cross-country haul was a regular gig for me. Chicago to Los Angeles, 5 days of nothing but asphalt, truck stops, and the company of my own thoughts. Usually I didn't mind the solitude. It gave me time to think, to sort through the cluttered attic of my mind. But this trip was different. I'd left Chicago with a heavy heart, the echoes of my latest fight with Sarah still ringing in my ears. 3 years together, and it felt like we were drifting apart, the miles I put on the road mirroring the growing distance between us. So when I saw the figure on the side of the road, thumb outstretched, I made a split-second decision that would change everything. Company, I thought. Someone to talk to keep the demons of my troubled relationship at bay for a few hours. I pulled over, the big rig's brakes hissing in the quiet night. As the man approached, I got my first good look at him. He was tall and lanky, with a scraggly beard and clothes that had seen better days. But it was his eyes that caught my attention. Wide and intense, with a glint that made me uneasy. "Where you headed?" I called out as he reached the passenger side. "West," he replied, his voice raspy. "As far as you're going." I hesitated for a moment, that little voice in the back of my head screaming that this was a bad idea. But the thought of another 100 miles of silence won out. "Hop in," I said, reaching over to unlock the door. "I'm headed to L.A." He climbed in, tossing a battered duffel bag at his feet. The cab filled with the musty odor of unwashed clothes and something else, something I couldn't quite place but that made my nose wrinkle. "Name's Jack," I offered as I pulled back onto the highway. He was quiet for a long moment, staring straight ahead. Just as I was about to repeat myself, thinking maybe he hadn't heard, he spoke. "You can call me Randall," he said, still not looking at me. The next hour passed in awkward silence. Every attempt I made at conversation was met with one-word answers or non-committal grunts. I was starting to regret my decision, the unease I'd felt earlier growing with each passing mile. It was sometime after midnight when Randall finally started talking. At first I was relieved, but as he spoke, that relief quickly turned to dread. "You ever think about how fragile life is, Jack?" he asked, his voice taking on a dreamy quality. "How easy it is to just snuff it out." I gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can't say that I have, buddy." Randall turned to look at me then, and the intensity in his eyes made me want to crawl out of my skin. "I think about it all the time," he continued. "How many ways there are to die out here on the open road. A blown tire at the wrong moment, a driver falling asleep at the wheel, a stranger with bad intentions." My heart was pounding now, blood rushing in my ears. I tried to focus on the road ahead, on the soothing repetition of the white lines disappearing under the truck. "You pick me up awful easy, Jack," Randall said, his tone conversational but with an undercurrent that sent chills down my spine. "Didn't your mama ever teach you not to talk to strangers?" I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. "Look, man, maybe this wasn't such a good idea. Why don't I let you out at the next rest stop?" Randall's hand shot out, gripping my arm with surprising strength. "Oh, I don't think so, Jack. We're just getting to know each other. In fact, I think it's time for a little detour." He reached into his duffel bag, pulling out a wicked-looking knife. The blade caught the light from the dashboard, and I felt my blood turn to ice. "Next exit," Randall said, his voice low and menacing. "You're going to take it, and then you're going to drive where I tell you to drive. Understand?" I nodded, my mind racing. How had I gotten myself into this situation? And more importantly, how was I going to get out of it? The next 20 minutes were the longest of my life. Randall directed me off the main highway and onto increasingly remote back roads. The darkness pressed in around us, the truck's headlights cutting through the night like twin beams of hope I was quickly losing grip on. Finally, we came to a stop on a dirt road surrounded by dense forest. The only sound was the idle of the engine and my own ragged breathing. "Turn it off," Randall commanded. I complied, plunging us into near total darkness. The sliver of moon overhead did little to illuminate the cab. "Please," I said, hating the tremor in my voice. "You don't have to do this. I've got money. It's not much, but—" Randall's laugh cut me off. It was a harsh, humorless sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "You think this is about money?" he sneered. "No, Jack. This is about something much more valuable. This is about life and death, about power." He leaned in close, and I could smell his sour breath. "You see, Jack, I've been traveling this road for a long time, and I've learned something. The only way to truly feel alive is to hold someone else's life in your hands." My mind was spinning, trying to process what was happening. This man wasn't just a criminal. He was something far worse, a predator who killed for the thrill of it. "Now," Randall continued, "we're going to play a little game. I'm going to ask you some questions. If I like your answers, you live. If I don't—" He let the threat hang in the air, the knife glinting in his hand. What followed was the most terrifying hour of my life. Randall asked me questions about everything. My childhood, my job, my relationship with Sarah. With each answer, he seemed to be weighing my worth, deciding whether I deserved to keep breathing. I told him about growing up in a small town in Ohio, about how I'd always dreamed of seeing the world beyond those cornfields. I talked about how I'd fallen into trucking almost by accident, but had grown to love the freedom of the open road. And I poured out my heart about Sarah, how we'd met, how happy we'd been at first, and how things had started to fall apart. As I spoke, I noticed something changing in Randall's demeanor. The manic gleam in his eyes dimmed slightly, replaced by something that looked almost like recognition. "You love her?" he said softly, interrupting my story. "Even though it's hard, even though you're afraid it might not work out?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Randall was quiet for a long moment, the knife lowering slightly. "I had someone like that once," he said, his voice distant. "A long time ago. Before." He trailed off, lost in some memory. I held my breath, afraid to move or speak, lest I break whatever spell had come over him. Suddenly, Randall's head snapped up, his eyes focusing on me with renewed intensity. "Start the truck," he barked. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the ignition. As the engine roared to life, Randall spoke again. "Drive," he said. "Back to the highway." I didn't need to be told twice. I threw the truck into gear and peeled out, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. We drove in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. As the lights of the highway came into view, Randall finally spoke again. "Pull over," he said, his voice weary. I complied, bringing the truck to a stop on the shoulder. Randall gathered his duffel bag, then turned to look at me one last time. "You've got a second chance, Jack," he said. "Don't waste it. Go home to Sarah. Fight for what you have." And with that, he was gone, disappearing into the night as quickly as he had appeared. I sat there for a long time, shaking, trying to process what had just happened. When I finally pulled back onto the highway, I knew two things with absolute certainty. First, I was the luckiest son of a bitch alive. And second, I was going home to Sarah. The load could wait. Some things were more important than a delivery deadline. As the miles rolled by, taking me back east instead of west, I thought about how close I'd come to losing everything. And I silently thanked whatever twist of fate had made Randall see himself in me, had made him choose mercy over murder. I've never picked up another hitchhiker, but every time I pass someone on the side of the road, thumb outstretched, I say a little prayer for them, for the driver who might stop, and for Randall, hoping that he found whatever redemption he was looking for out there on the lonely highway. The storm wasn't natural, and neither were the people of Millhaven. What started as an unplanned detour became a desperate struggle to escape a town with a terrifying secret. We were 3 hours into our family road trip when the first drops of rain hit the windshield. My wife Lisa was dozing in the passenger seat, and our kids, Ethan and Mia, were engrossed in their tablets in the back. I smiled to myself, enjoying the rare moment of peace on our journey to my parents' house for Thanksgiving. The radio crackled with a weather alert, warning of severe thunderstorms moving into the area. I frowned, glancing at the darkening sky ahead. We still had a good 5 hours of driving, and the last thing I wanted was to navigate unfamiliar roads in a downpour. "Maybe we should find a place to stop for the night," Lisa suggested, stirring from her nap. "Better safe than sorry." I nodded, already scanning the GPS for nearby towns. "Looks like there's a place called Millhaven about 20 miles ahead. Should have a motel or something." As we drove on, the storm intensified with alarming speed. Rain lashed the car, and wind buffeted us from all sides. Lightning split the sky, followed by thunder so loud it made Mia whimper in the back seat. "It's okay, sweetie," Lisa reassured her. "We'll be somewhere safe soon." If only we'd known how wrong she was. We rolled into Millhaven just as the tornado sirens began to wail. The town looked like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting, quaint storefronts, a town square with a gazebo, and neatly kept houses lining the streets. But right now, it was a ghost town, every building shuttered tight against the storm. As I navigated the empty streets, searching for a motel or any sign of life, a figure suddenly darted in front of our car. I slammed on the brakes, heart pounding. It was an old man, soaked to the bone and wild-eyed. He pounded on the driver's side window. "You folks need to get inside," he shouted over the howling wind. "Follow me." Under normal circumstances, I might have hesitated. But with the storm raging and my family's safety on the line, I didn't see much choice. We followed the old man's pickup truck through the winding streets, finally pulling up in front of a large brick building. "Town Hall," the old man explained as we rushed inside. "It's our shelter during bad storms." The interior was dim, lit only by emergency lights. As my eyes adjusted, I realized we weren't alone. Dozens of people huddled in small groups, their faces a mix of fear and something else I couldn't quite place. "Name's Earl," our rescuer said, extending a gnarled hand. "Welcome to Millhaven." I introduced our family, thanking Earl for his help. As Lisa got the kids settled on a nearby bench, I asked about the storm. Earl's expression darkened. "Ain't no ordinary storm," he muttered. "It's him. He's angry again." Before I could ask what he meant, a booming voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. "Newcomers." A large man with a sheriff's badge strode towards us, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "I'm Sheriff Dawson. Glad you folks found shelter. Looks like you'll be our guests for the night." Something about his tone made me uneasy, but I chalked it up to the stress of the situation. We settled in as best we could, making small talk with some of the townspeople. But as the hours wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The storm showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse, and the locals were acting strange. They spoke in hushed tones, casting furtive glances our way. More than once, I caught snippets of conversation that made no sense, talk of appeasing him and the choosing. Around midnight, Sheriff Dawson called for everyone's attention. "Folks, it's clear this storm ain't passing anytime soon. We all know what that means." A ripple of unease passed through the crowd. I felt Lisa's hand tighten around mine. "It's time for the choosing," Dawson continued. "As is our tradition, we'll draw names. One from the townspeople and one from our guests." My blood ran cold. What the hell was he talking about? Before I could voice my objection, 2 bowls were produced. Dawson reached into the first, pulling out a slip of paper. "From Millhaven, Sarah Collins." A young woman let out a choked sob, quickly hushed by those around her. Dawson's hand hovered over the second bowl, the one with our names. Time seemed to stand still as he unfolded the paper. "And from our guests, Mia Thompson." "No." The word tore from my throat before I could stop it. Lisa clutched Mia to her chest, eyes wide with terror. The room erupted into chaos. Townspeople surged forward, trying to separate us from our daughter. I fought like a madman, throwing punches at anyone who came near. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Ethan biting the hand of a man who'd grabbed his arm. "Stop this!" I roared, my voice barely audible over the commotion. "What the hell is wrong with you people?" Suddenly, a gunshot rang out. Sheriff Dawson stood on a table, pistol raised. "That's enough," he bellowed. "You're only making this harder on yourselves." As the crowd fell silent, Dawson fixed us with a cold stare. "I understand this is difficult for you folks to accept, but you need to understand. This is how things work in Millhaven. The storm won't stop until he's appeased, and he demands a sacrifice." Lisa's voice shook as she spoke. "You're insane, all of you. We're leaving now." Dawson shook his head. "I'm afraid that's not possible. The roads are flooded, and even if they weren't, well, we can't let you leave. Not now that you know." The reality of our situation hit me like a physical blow. We were trapped in a town full of lunatics who wanted to sacrifice our daughter to some, what, storm god? I met Lisa's eyes, seeing my own fear and determination reflected there. Without a word, we knew what we had to do. What followed was a nightmare of biblical proportions. Somehow, in the chaos that erupted, we managed to fight our way to a side door. We ran into the storm, rain pelting us like bullets, wind threatening to knock us off our feet. Behind us, I could hear shouts and the baying of dogs. They were hunting us. We stumbled through flooded streets, trying to find our way back to our car. Lightning illuminated the town in strobes, revealing glimpses of figures in robes, carrying torches despite the downpour. At one point, we ducked into an alley, huddling behind a dumpster as a group of searchers passed by. Mia whimpered, and I pressed her face against my chest, praying she'd stay quiet. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, we finally spotted our car. But as we approached, my heart sank. The tires were slashed. "Over there," Lisa whispered, pointing to a battered pickup truck. The keys dangled in the ignition. I didn't hesitate. "Get in," I told my family, sliding behind the wheel. The engine roared to life, drowning out the sound of approaching voices. We tore out of town, windshield wipers barely keeping up with the deluge. In the rearview mirror, I could see headlights following us. The sheriff and his posse, no doubt. What happened next, I still have trouble believing. As we reached the town limits, the storm intensified to a degree I wouldn't have thought possible. The wind howled like a living thing, and the rain came down so hard it felt like we were driving underwater. And then, rising out of the maelstrom, I saw something. A shape, massive and impossible, writhing in the clouds. For a moment I could have sworn I saw eyes, ancient, malevolent, and fixed directly on us. I gunned the engine, pushing the old truck to its limits. Behind us I heard a sound that will haunt my nightmares forever. A roar that shook the very air around us, filled with rage and hunger. We drove for hours, the storm gradually lessening as we put distance between us and Millhaven. It wasn't until we reached the next town, soaked and shaking, that we finally felt safe enough to stop. The police, of course, didn't believe our story. They found no record of a town called Millhaven, and when they sent cars to investigate, they reported finding nothing but empty fields where we swore the town had been. It's been years, but I still wake up in a cold sweat some nights, the memory of that writhing shape in the clouds fresh in my mind. We don't take family road trips anymore, and every time I see storm clouds gathering on the horizon, I say a silent prayer of thanks that we escaped, and hope that whatever lurks in Millhaven never decides to venture beyond its borders. Because out there, somewhere, is a town that doesn't appear on any map. A town where the storms are alive, and the price of calm weather is paid in blood. And God help you if you ever find yourself seeking shelter in Millhaven. The antique music box played a melody of dread, and I knew the Wellington family's secrets were far darker than I'd ever imagined. What started as a simple house-sitting job became a desperate fight to survive a night of occult horrors. When my college roommate Jess asked if I'd house-sit for her wealthy aunt and uncle, I jumped at the chance. A week in a luxurious mansion, getting paid to lounge by the pool and raid the fridge? It sounded like a dream gig. If only I'd known the nightmare that awaited me. The Wellingtons' estate was impressive, to say the least. Sprawling gardens surrounded a massive Victorian-style home that looked like something out of a Gothic novel. As Jess gave me the grand tour, I couldn't help but feel a bit overwhelmed. "Don't worry, Em," Jess said, noticing my wide-eyed expression. "It's not as complicated as it looks. Just water the plants, feed the cat, and make sure nothing burns down." She laughed, but there was an edge to it that I couldn't quite place. As we reached the master bedroom, Jess's demeanor changed. She lowered her voice, glancing nervously at the closed door. "One more thing. Whatever you do, don't go into my aunt and uncle's room. They're very private people." I nodded, though I couldn't help but feel curious. What could they possibly be hiding in there? Jess left, and I settled in for what I thought would be a relaxing week. The first couple of days were uneventful. I lounged by the pool, explored the extensive library, and got to know Mr. Whiskers, the Wellingtons' rather aloof cat. It was on the third night that things started to get weird. I was jolted awake by a sound I couldn't quite place, a tinkling melody that seemed to be coming from somewhere in the house. Groggy and disoriented, I followed the music, my bare feet silent on the plush carpets. The sound led me to the second floor, right to the door of the master bedroom. My hand was on the doorknob before I remembered Jess's warning, but the music was so haunting, so alluring. Surely a quick peek wouldn't hurt. I opened the door and the melody grew louder. The room was dark, lit only by moonlight filtering through heavy curtains. As my eyes adjusted, I saw the source of the music, an ornate antique box sitting on a dresser. Drawn as if by some unseen force, I approached the box. It was beautiful, covered in intricate carvings that seemed to move in the dim light. Without thinking, I reached out to touch it. The moment my fingers brushed the smooth wood, the music stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was deafening, and then I heard it, a low guttural growl coming from behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding. There, emerging from the shadows, was Mr. Whiskers. But this wasn't the standoffish house cat I'd been feeding for the past few days. His eyes glowed an unnatural red, and he seemed to be growing. I watched in horror as the cat's form twisted and expanded, fur giving way to leathery skin, claws lengthening into razor-sharp talons. In a matter of seconds, what stood before me was no longer a cat, but a monstrous creature straight out of a nightmare. I ran, out of the bedroom, down the stairs, my mind reeling as I tried to process what I'd just seen. But the house had changed. Corridors stretched impossibly long. Doors led to rooms that shouldn't exist. It was as if the entire structure had come alive, determined to keep me trapped inside. As I rounded a corner, I collided with something solid. I looked up to see a man in dark robes, his face hidden beneath a hood. He grabbed my arm, his grip inhumanly strong. "You shouldn't be here," he hissed, his voice like gravel. "The ritual has already begun." Before I could react, more robed figures emerged from the shadows. They surrounded me, chanting in a language I didn't recognize. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. I broke free from the man's grasp and ran again, no destination in mind other than away. I could hear them pursuing, their chants growing louder, more frenzied. I found myself in the library, desperately searching for a way out. As I ran my hands along the bookshelves, I felt something give way. A hidden door swung open, revealing a narrow passage. Without hesitation, I ducked inside. The passage led down, deep beneath the house. The air grew cold and damp, the only light coming from strange, phosphorescent fungi growing on the walls. The tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber. Torches lined the walls, illuminating a scene that turned my blood to ice. In the center of the room stood a massive stone altar, surrounded by more robed figures. And on that altar, bound and struggling, was Jess. "Emily," she cried out when she saw me. "Run! Get out of here!" But it was too late. Strong hands grabbed me from behind, dragging me towards the altar. I fought with everything I had, but it was useless against their supernatural strength. As they forced me to my knees, I got my first clear look at the leader of this twisted cult. It was Mr. Wellington, Jess's uncle, but his face was wrong. His features seemed to shift and change, as if multiple faces were trying to occupy the same space. "Ah, the uninvited guest," he said, his voice resonating with an otherworldly power. "How fortunate. The Great One will be pleased with this additional offering." "Please," I begged, my voice shaking. "What is this? What are you doing?" Wellington's laugh was like nails on a chalkboard. "We are ushering in a new age, child. The old ones will rise again, and we shall be their loyal servants." He turned to the assembled cultists. "Brothers and sisters, the stars are aligned. The gateway is opening. It is time to complete the ritual." The chanting resumed louder than ever. The air in the chamber began to ripple and distort like heat waves on asphalt, and in the center of it all, above the altar, a tear began to form in the very fabric of reality. Through that impossible opening, I caught glimpses of something beyond comprehension. A writhing mass of tentacles and eyes, ancient and malevolent. The sight of it threatened to shatter my sanity. As Wellington raised a wicked-looking dagger, preparing to plunge it into Jess's chest, something inside me snapped. With strength born of desperation, I broke free from my captors. I lunged for the altar, knocking the dagger from Wellington's hand. What followed was chaos. Cultists swarmed around us as Jess and I fought for our lives. The thing in the portal reached out with impossible tentacles, grasping at anything within reach. In the melee, I found myself once again near the music box. Acting on instinct, I grabbed it and hurled it towards the portal with all my might. The moment the box passed through the opening, an unearthly shriek filled the chamber. The portal began to collapse in on itself, pulling everything nearby into its swirling vortex. Cultists screamed as they were sucked in, their bodies twisting and contorting as they vanished into the nothingness beyond. Wellington made a desperate grab for us, but he too was pulled in. His final cry cut short as the portal snapped shut, and then silence. Jess and I clung to each other, battered and terrified, but alive. The aftermath was a blur. We managed to find our way out of the tunnels and called the police. They didn't believe our story, of course. How could they? The official report chalked it up to a home invasion, with the Wellingtons listed as missing persons. Jess and I know the truth, though. We saw behind the veil that night, glimpsed horrors that no human was meant to see. The Wellingtons' mansion has been demolished, the land salted and declared unfit for habitation. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear that haunting melody playing on the wind. I don't house sit anymore. In fact, I rarely leave my apartment these days, because now I know that there are things lurking in the shadows, ancient and hungry, and sometimes all it takes is the turn of a key or the opening of a door to let them in. So if you ever find yourself in a strange house and you hear an alluring melody coming from behind a locked door, run. Run as fast and as far as you can, because some secrets are better left uncovered, and some doors should never be opened. The darkness in the mine wasn't natural, and neither were the sounds echoing through the tunnels. What started as an adventurous exploration turned into a desperate fight for survival against something inhuman lurking in the depths. It was supposed to be the highlight of our camping trip. 5 friends reunited after years apart, seeking one last adventure before real life pulled us in different directions again. When Mike suggested exploring the old Holloway mine, it seemed like the perfect way to recapture that sense of excitement we'd shared in our younger days. If only we'd known what was waiting for us in those dark tunnels. The day started bright and clear, a perfect September morning in the mountains. We'd spent the previous 2 days hiking, fishing, and reliving old memories around the campfire. But as we approached the mine entrance, a sense of unease settled over me. The opening was larger than I'd expected, a gaping maw in the mountainside partially obscured by overgrown vegetation. A weathered sign warned of danger and prohibited entry, but Mike just laughed it off. "Come on, guys," he said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "Where's your sense of adventure?" Sarah, always the cautious one, voiced what I was thinking. "I don't know, Mike. This seems pretty risky. What if there's a cave-in or something?" But Jason and Liz were already following Mike towards the entrance, their headlamps cutting through the gloom. I exchanged a worried glance with Sarah before sighing and following suit. I couldn't let them go in there alone, could I? The first 100 yards or so weren't too bad. The main tunnel was wide and relatively stable, supported by old timber frames. Our voices echoed off the rocky walls as we marveled at the remnants of mining equipment left behind decades ago. It was when we reached the first junction that things started to feel off. The air grew colder, heavy with a musty scent that made my nose wrinkle. And there was something else, a faint vibration that I felt more than heard, like the mountain itself was humming. "Which way?" Jason asked, his voice unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence that had fallen over us. Mike consulted the crude map he'd downloaded from some urban exploration forum. "Left, I think. That should take us to the main excavation chamber." As we ventured deeper, the tunnel narrowed and the ceiling lowered. We had to duck in places to avoid scraping our heads on jutting rocks. The beams from our headlamps seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, barely penetrating more than a few feet ahead. That's when we heard it, a sound that didn't belong in this long-abandoned mine. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible beneath the sound of our own breathing and footsteps. But as we paused to listen, it grew clearer, a rhythmic scratching like claws on stone coming from somewhere up ahead. "What is that?" Liz whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Probably just some animal," Mike said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. A raccoon or something that wandered in. I wasn't convinced. Whatever was making that sound was bigger than a raccoon, and somehow, I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my core, it was aware of our presence. We should have turned back then. Every instinct was screaming at me to get out, to run back towards the sunlight and safety, but a morbid curiosity pushed us forward, deeper into the mine's twisted labyrinth. The scratching grew louder as we approached another junction. This time it was accompanied by something else, a low, guttural growl that raised the hair on the back of my neck. Suddenly, Sarah screamed. Her headlamp had illuminated something on the tunnel floor, a dark, wet stain that could only be blood. And leading away from it, drag marks disappearing into the darkness. Panic set in. We turned to retrace our steps, but nothing looked familiar. Had we come from the left tunnel or the right? The mine seemed to have shifted around us, the passages twisting in impossible ways. "This way," Mike shouted, taking the lead. We followed blindly, our earlier excitement replaced by raw fear. We ran through the darkness, the sound of our pounding footsteps eclipsed by that terrible scratching, now seeming to come from all around us. The air grew thicker, filled with a choking dust that made it hard to breathe. I don't know how long we ran. Time lost all meaning in that lightless maze. But eventually we burst into a large chamber, our headlamps revealing rusted mining equipment and a partially collapsed ceiling. "Look," Jason cried out, pointing to a shaft of natural light filtering down through a crack in the rock above. "We can climb out." But as we moved towards our potential escape route, a bone-chilling roar echoed through the chamber. And then we saw it. It emerged from one of the tunnels, a creature that defied description. In the frantic sweep of our headlamps, I caught glimpses of pale, leathery skin stretched over an emaciated frame. Its limbs were too long, too jointed, ending in wicked claws that scraped against the stone floor. But it was the face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. A noseless, eyeless visage dominated by a mouthful of needle-sharp teeth. We scattered, primal terror overriding any semblance of rational thought. I found myself pressed against the chamber wall, my heart threatening to burst from my chest as I watched the monstrosity stalk towards Mike, who had tripped over a piece of old equipment. What happened next is a blur of screams, blood, and frantic scrambling. I remember Liz throwing a rock at the creature, buying Mike enough time to crawl away. I remember Sarah pulling me towards the shaft of light, her nails digging into my arm as she urged me to climb. Jason didn't make it. The last I saw of him, he was disappearing down one of the tunnels, the creature in pursuit, his agonized screams echoing through the mine until they were suddenly, horribly silenced. The four of us that remained clawed our way up through the narrow opening, scraping skin from our hands and knees in our desperation to escape. We emerged into the fading afternoon light, gasping and sobbing, but our nightmare wasn't over. As we stumbled away from the mine entrance, we heard that scratching again, growing louder. The creature was coming. "Run!" I screamed, my voice raw with terror. We fled through the woods, branches whipping at our faces, roots threatening to trip us at every step. Behind us, I could hear the sound of pursuit, the crack of breaking branches, the thud of inhuman feet on the forest floor. I don't know how we made it back to our campsite. By some miracle, we managed to reach my truck. As I fumbled with the keys, I saw movement at the edge of the clearing, a pale, horrific shape emerging from the underbrush. The engine roared to life, and I floored it, tires spinning in the dirt before finding purchase. As we sped away, I caught one last glimpse in the rearview mirror of that nightmarish face, mouth open in a silent roar of fury and hunger. We drove for hours, not stopping until we reached the nearest town. The police, of course, didn't believe our story. They searched the area but found no sign of Jason or the creature we described. The mine entrance had collapsed, they told us, probably due to our reckless exploration. It's been 5 years since that day, but the memories still haunt me. I can't look at a cave or even a dark room without breaking into a cold sweat. The others have tried to move on, to rationalize what happened, but I know the truth. There are things in this world that defy explanation, horrors lurking in the dark places of the earth. And sometimes, if you go looking for adventure in those shadowy depths, you might just find something looking back. I don't go camping anymore. I stay in the city surrounded by light and noise and people. But on quiet nights, when the wind blows just right, I swear I can hear it. That faint rhythmic scratching. A reminder that the creature is still out there, waiting in the darkness for its next unsuspecting victim. So if you're ever tempted to explore an abandoned mine or cave, think twice, because you never know what might be waiting in the shadows, hungry and patient, ready to drag you down into the depths where the sun never shines and screams echo endlessly through lightless tunnels. The first time I saw a patient's eyes glow in the dark, I knew Millbrook wasn't just a quaint small town. It was the epicenter of a medical nightmare that threatened to consume us all. I'd been thrilled when I landed the position at Millbrook General Hospital. Fresh out of residency, I saw it as the perfect opportunity to make a difference in a rural community while paying off my mountain of student debt. The town itself was picturesque, all tree-lined streets and friendly faces. But beneath that Norman Rockwell exterior lurked horrors I could never have imagined. My first few weeks were uneventful. I treated the usual array of minor injuries and illnesses, getting to know the townsfolk and settling into the rhythm of small-town life. It was during a late-night shift in the ER that I first noticed something was amiss. A man came in complaining of severe abdominal pain. As I examined him, I noticed his skin had an odd, waxy texture. When I mentioned it, he brushed it off, claiming it was just dry skin from working outdoors. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of fear, quickly suppressed, that set my nerves on edge. As I was preparing to order some tests, the power in the hospital flickered. In that brief moment of darkness, I could have sworn the man's eyes emitted a faint, greenish glow. I blinked, and when the light stabilized, everything seemed normal again. I tried to convince myself I was just overtired, seeing things that weren't there. But that incident marked the beginning of a series of strange occurrences that would shatter my understanding of medicine and reality itself. Over the next few months, I encountered more patients with unusual symptoms, skin abnormalities, unexplained lumps, and in one terrifying case, a child whose teeth seemed to be constantly growing and reshaping. Each time I tried to investigate further, I hit a wall of silence. Patients would clam up, suddenly remembering prior commitments and rushing out of the hospital. My colleagues were no help. Whenever I tried to discuss these cases, they'd change the subject or give me patronizing looks, as if I were some naive city doctor who couldn't handle rural medicine. But I knew something was wrong. Terribly, fundamentally wrong. It all came to a head one stormy night in October. A young woman was brought in, unconscious and convulsing. Her skin was covered in a fine, moss-like growth, and her veins pulsed with an unnatural, bioluminescent glow. As I frantically worked to stabilize her, Dr. Emerson, the hospital's senior physician, burst into the room. "Step away from the patient, Dr. Chen," he barked, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "What? No, she needs help," I protested, continuing to administer treatment. Emerson's hand clamped down on my arm with surprising strength. I said, "Step away." Now, before I could argue further, a team of men in hazmat suits rushed in, quickly transferring the woman to a sealed container. They were gone as swiftly as they had appeared, leaving me standing in stunned silence. Emerson's expression was grim as he turned to me. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "But not here. Meet me at the old Millbrook Mill in an hour." "Come alone." My mind reeled as I drove through the rain-slicked streets to the abandoned mill on the outskirts of town. What the hell was going on? Who were those men, and what had happened to that poor woman? Emerson was waiting for me in the shadows of the dilapidated building. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, his face lined with worry and fatigue. "I suppose I owe you an explanation," he began, his voice barely audible above the patter of rain on the rusted metal roof. "But I need you to understand. What I'm about to tell you will change everything. Your life, your understanding of medicine, of the very nature of reality itself. Are you sure you want to know?" I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. Emerson sighed heavily. "Millbrook has a secret, one that goes back generations. There's something wrong with this place. The soil, the water, maybe even the air itself. It changes people, Dr. Chen, alters them on a fundamental level." He went on to describe a history of mutations and strange afflictions that had plagued the town for over a century. The local government and medical community had been covering it up for decades, fearing mass panic and government intervention. "But lately it's been getting worse," Emerson continued, his eyes darting nervously around the empty mill. "The changes are happening faster, becoming more extreme. We can barely keep up with the cases, let alone find a way to stop it." I listened in horrified fascination as Emerson outlined the town's desperate attempts to contain the situation. Secret medical facilities hidden in abandoned mines, experimental treatments that often did more harm than good, and a complex system of misdirection to keep outsiders from discovering the truth. "Why are you telling me all this?" I asked when he finally fell silent. Emerson's gaze met mine, and I saw a glimmer of hope there. "Because we need help, Dr. Chen. Fresh eyes, new ideas. The old guard, we're running out of options. And time." What followed was a crash course in fringe science and medical horrors. I spent my days maintaining the facade of normalcy at the hospital, while my nights were consumed with clandestine research and treatment of the most severe cases. I saw things that defied explanation. Patients whose bodies were literally reshaping themselves, organs migrating and fusing in impossible ways. I assisted in surgeries that would have made Frankenstein blanch, desperately trying to reverse mutations that threatened to rob people of their humanity. But for every small victory, there were a dozen crushing defeats. The anomalies were spreading, becoming harder to conceal. And worse, I began to suspect that some in the town's leadership saw these mutations not as a curse, but as an opportunity. I discovered files detailing attempts to weaponize the mutations, to create super soldiers with enhanced abilities. The ethical implications were staggering, and I knew I couldn't stand by and let it happen. With Emerson's help, I began secretly documenting everything. The treatments, the cover-ups, the town's hidden history. We were going to expose it all, consequences be damned. But someone must have gotten wind of our plan. One night, as I was leaving the hidden facility deep in the old mine system, I was ambushed. A group of men in dark suits cornered me, their eyes gleaming with that now familiar bioluminescence. "Did you really think we wouldn't notice, Dr. Chen?" One of them sneered, his voice distorted by the mutations ravaging his vocal cords. "This is bigger than you, bigger than Millbrook. The changes, they're just the beginning." I fought back with everything I had. my physician's oath to do no harm, momentarily forgotten in the face of this existential threat. In the chaos of the fight, a stray bullet hit something in the cavern wall, something that definitely wasn't rock. A noxious gas began filling the tunnel, causing my attackers to convulse and collapse. I held my breath and ran, not stopping until I reached the surface. Behind me, I heard inhuman screams echoing from the depths. I fled Millbrook that night, taking with me only the clothes on my back and a hard drive full of evidence. I've been on the run ever since, trying to stay one step ahead of those who would keep Millbrook's secrets buried. I'm writing this now from a motel room in a town whose name I don't even know. My skin itches constantly, and sometimes in the mirror I swear I see a faint glow in my eyes. I don't know if I was exposed to whatever is causing the mutations or if it's just paranoia taking hold. But I do know this. The truth about Millbrook needs to come out. Whatever is happening there, it's not contained. It's spreading, evolving, and God help us all if it can't be stopped. So if you're a doctor and you get an offer to work in a quaint little town called Millbrook, do yourself a favor. Run. Run as far and as fast as you can, because some medical mysteries are better left unsolved, and some cures are far worse than the disease. The stranger on the island watched us with hungry eyes, and I knew our paradise had become a prison. What started as a romantic getaway on a secluded houseboat turned into a desperate fight for survival against a madman who saw us as his prey. When Sarah suggested renting a houseboat for our anniversary, I was all for it. 2 weeks of floating serenity, just the two of us, far from the chaos of our busy lives in the city. The brochure painted a picture of crystal clear waters, breathtaking sunsets, and absolute privacy. It sounded perfect. We arrived at the marina on a sunny Tuesday afternoon. The rental agent, a weathered old man with a permanent squint, gave us a quick rundown of the boat's features and handed over the keys with a gruff warning. "Stay away from Osprey Island," he said, jabbing a gnarled finger at a spot on our map. "Nature preserve, off limits." We nodded, not really paying attention. We were too excited about starting our vacation to worry about some restricted island. The first few days were bliss. We lounged on the deck, swam in the warm waters, and reconnected in ways we hadn't in years. On the fourth night, as we sipped wine and watched the sun dip below the horizon, Sarah pointed to a dark shape in the distance. "Is that Osprey Island?" she asked. I squinted, following her gaze. "Must be. Looks closer than I thought." As darkness fell, I noticed a pinprick of light on the island's shore. A campfire, maybe? But that didn't make sense if it was a restricted area. "Probably just some kids sneaking over there to party," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Sarah frowned. "Should we report it?" I shook my head. "Let's not worry about it. We're here to relax, remember?" But as we settled in for the night, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. Something about that light, that island, felt wrong. The next morning I woke early and went up on deck to watch the sunrise. As I sipped my coffee, movement on the island caught my eye. A figure stood on the shore, motionless, facing our boat. Even from this distance, I could feel the weight of their stare. A chill ran down my spine. I hurried back inside, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. It was probably just a ranger checking on the island, nothing to worry about. But over the next few days, the sightings continued. Sometimes it was just a glimpse of movement among the trees. Other times the figure would stand openly on the beach, watching us, always watching. Sarah noticed my growing agitation. "What's wrong, Jack? You've been on edge for days." I hesitated, not wanting to frighten her. But as I opened my mouth to make up some excuse, a flash of metal on the island's shore caught my eye. The stranger was there again, and this time I could have sworn I saw the glint of binoculars. "There's someone on that island," I blurted out. "They've been watching us." Sarah's eyes widened. "What? For how long?" I told her everything I'd seen. As I spoke, her face paled. "We need to leave," she said, her voice shaking. "Now." I nodded, already moving to start the engine, but when I turned the key, nothing happened. The motor sputtered weakly, then fell silent. Panic rose in my throat as I tried again and again to start the boat. Nothing. We were dead in the water. "The radio," Sarah said. "Call for help." But the radio, like the engine, was silent. No static, no signal, nothing. As the reality of our situation sank in, a new sound reached us, the low purr of an outboard motor. We rushed to the deck to see a small boat speeding towards us from the direction of the island. "Get inside," I told Sarah, trying to keep my voice steady. "Lock the door. Don't come out no matter what you hear." She squeezed my hand, fear plain in her eyes, then disappeared below deck. I stood my ground, heart pounding as the boat drew near. The man who stepped aboard our houseboat was not what I expected. He was tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and piercing blue eyes. He could have been anywhere from 40 to 60. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Well, hello there," he said, his voice surprisingly cultured. "Having some engine trouble?" I nodded warily, keeping my distance. "Yeah, can't seem to get it started. You live on the island?" His smile widened. "Oh yes, Osprey Island has been my home for quite some time now. I do hope I haven't alarmed you with my presence. It's just been so long since I've had visitors." There was something in his tone, a barely concealed eagerness that made my skin crawl. I realized with growing horror that this man hadn't just been watching us. He'd been hunting us. "Listen," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "We appreciate your concern, but we've got help on the way. Why don't you head back to your island and we'll be out of your hair soon?" The man's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold calculation. Now, he said, taking a step closer. "There's no need for lies between friends. We both know your radio isn't working, just like we both know I made sure your engine wouldn't start." My blood ran cold. I glanced around, looking for anything I could use as a weapon. "What do you want?" I asked, buying time. He sighed, as if disappointed by my lack of understanding. "Company, of course. Do you have any idea how lonely it gets out here? How maddening the silence can be?" His eyes glittered with a manic light. "But now you're here, both of you, and we're going to have so much fun together." He moved with shocking speed, closing the distance between us before I could react. I felt a sharp pain in my neck and the world began to spin. As I collapsed to the deck, my last conscious thought was of Sarah, trapped below, unaware of the nightmare that had just begun. I woke to the sound of waves lapping against the shore. My head throbbed and my mouth felt like it was stuffed with cotton. As I blinked away the fog, I realized I was no longer on the houseboat. I was on the island, tied to a tree at the edge of a small clearing. Panic surged through me as I remembered what had happened. I twisted against my bonds, ignoring the pain as the rough rope bit into my wrists. "Sarah," I called out, my voice hoarse. "Sarah, where are you?" "She can't hear you, I'm afraid." The man from the boat emerged from the trees, that unnerving smile still plastered on his face. "Don't worry, she's quite safe. For now. If you've hurt her, I swear to God." He cut me off with a laugh. "Hurt her? My dear boy, why would I damage my new toys so quickly? No. The game has only just begun." Over the next few hours, he outlined his twisted plan. He'd been living on the island for years, occasionally luring in unsuspecting tourists for his deranged games of cat and mouse. Sarah and I were just the latest in a long line of victims. "But you two," he said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "You're special. So much fight in you both. This is going to be exhilarating." As night fell, he untied me from the tree, keeping the bonds on my wrists. "Let's go see how your lovely wife is doing, shall we?" He led me through the dense forest to a dilapidated cabin. Inside, Sarah was tied to a chair, her face tear-streaked but defiant. "Jack," she cried out when she saw me, "are you okay?" I nodded, relief flooding through me at the sight of her alive and seemingly unharmed. "I'm fine. We're going to get out of this, I promise." Our captor clapped his hands together. Touching reunion, truly. But now it's time for the real fun to begin. What followed was a nightmare beyond imagination. He released us into the forest, giving us a head start before he began his hunt. We ran blindly through the underbrush, the sound of his laughter echoing behind us. For days we played this deadly game of hide and seek. We'd find moments of respite, huddled in caves or dense thickets, only to hear his taunting voice drawing near. He seemed to toy with us, always letting us think we'd escaped, only to appear when we least expected it. On the third night, as we cowered in the hollow of a massive tree, Sarah turned to me with determination in her eyes. "We can't keep running," she whispered. "We need to fight back." She was right. We were exhausted, dehydrated, and running out of options. It was time to turn the tables on our tormentor. Using skills I didn't know we possessed, we set traps throughout the forest. We fashioned weapons from branches and stones, and when he came for us again, we were ready. The final confrontation was brutal and terrifying. He was stronger and more experienced, but we had the desperation of those fighting for their lives. In the end, it was Sarah who landed the decisive blow, sending him tumbling down a rocky slope. We didn't wait to see if he survived the fall. We sprinted for the shore, found his boat, and fled the island as fast as the small motor would carry us. The authorities didn't believe our story at first, but the evidence we led them to on the island, the cabin, the remnants of past victims, was undeniable. They never found our tormentor's body, though. Sometimes I wake in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear his laughter on the wind. Sarah and I are in therapy now, trying to process the trauma of those days on the island. Our marriage is stronger than ever, forged in the crucible of shared survival. But we'll never be the same. We don't go near large bodies of water anymore, and the sight of a houseboat is enough to send us into a panic. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see him standing on that shore, watching us with those hungry eyes. And I wonder, with a chill that reaches my very soul, if somewhere out there, he's still watching, waiting for his next unwary victims to drift into his twisted game. So if you're ever planning a quiet getaway on a houseboat, do yourself a favor. Stay away from remote islands, no matter how picturesque they might seem, because you never know what kind of predators might be lurking in paradise, waiting to turn your dream vacation into a waking nightmare.